Hello, it's midday here on the East Coast of the United States, but we have speakers and participants from all over the globe. So I'll say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are when you're watching this. Welcome to our virtual conference. Our sponsor for this conference is Howard University's School of Law. We thank them very much for being our sponsor today. The topic we're going to be discussing is the contemporary decline of Turkish judicial practice, perspectives on the purge of judicial workers, and the deterioration of the rule of law in Turkey. I'm Wendy Lawson-C, your moderator for today's conference. I'm an attorney in private practice in South Carolina on the East Coast of the United States. I first fell in love with Turkey and its people in 2008. And since then, I have been an ardent advocate for my beloved adopted homeland. I am deeply distressed by the decline of freedoms in Turkey, so it is an honor to facilitate today's discussion. First, I want to provide a moment of background on the topic. The recent rise of authoritarianism in Turkey has heavily impacted the Turkish judicial system. Since the coup attempt in 2016, Erdogan's government has used its state of emergency to arrest, dismiss, and arbitrarily transfer judges and prosecutors. Those who were dismissed are permanently banned from working in the public sector. Just to put that in a little bit of perspective, driving a bus or taxi is considered working in the public sector. Erdogan's interference reaches into the private sector as well. Private lawyers who take on politically sensitive cases are frequently victims of violence and threats. The government's opportunistic attacks and purges are paralyzing the independence of Turkey's judiciary. Our 7 speakers today will address this deterioration of the rule of law in Turkey. Our goal is to foster a deeper understanding of how Erdogan's authoritarianism is destroying human rights in Turkey. Let's get started. Our first presenter is Dr. Alfred Dizzaz. He was a UN independent expert on the promotion of democratic and equitable international order until 2018. He is a former senior lawyer with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He retired from the New York and Florida bars. He's authored 9 books and is the past president of PEN International. Today, he's going to discuss how the rule of law is a core value of civilization and how the UN and EU both have double standards with respect to Turkey. Dr. Dizzaz, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Wendy. And I also thank the organizers at the Howard University Law School. I teach law here at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. I have taught law at the University of Geneva, at the Graduate Institute, at the University of Vancouver, UBC, and at DePaul University School of Law way back in 1993-94. I was professor in Chicago. Now, in my function as secretary of the United Nations Human Rights Committee and as chief of the petitions department, that's being registrar of all petitions procedures of the Committee Against Torture, Human Rights Committee, Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, etc. I had the opportunity for over 20 years to deal with the situation in Turkey. Of course, it is since 2016 that we have seen a major deterioration of the human rights situation in Turkey. And this has been a subject of concern to many of my colleagues at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, obviously to the Human Rights Council. As you know, the Universal Periodic Review of Turkey took place in January 2020, and there were 320, 330 recommendations, of which Turkey accepted some 210 or something of that nature. As the case may be, it's not just naming and shaming that we're intending. It is not just trying to embarrass Erdogan or the Turkish government. We want to say to Turkey, look, you got big problems, and we'd like to help you restore the rule of law in Turkey. Now, when I'm talking about the rule of law, I'm not just saying normativism or positivism or dura lex et lex. Of course, there are laws in Turkey, but how are these laws being applied? I mean, already Cicero, 2,000 years ago, said summum jus summa injuria. I mean, the excess of law results invariably in injustice. And Turkey, of course, has laws, but it's been violating its own laws. It has changed its own laws. It has corrupted the judicial machinery. It has dismissed prosecutors, judges, professors of law, teachers. I mean, in the thousands. There's no other country right now that has as many journalists jailed as Turkey. It has become a situation of state terrorism vis-a-vis their own population. What I'd like to see, of course, is honesty on the part of the European authorities. I'd like to see advisory services and technical assistance being offered to Turkey in order, without undue embarrassment or condemnation of whatever, let's get back to a system of predictability in law. That is one of those values that we consider core values within the concept of the rule of law. I mean, the rule of law means separation of powers. It means checks and balances. That means that you cannot have authoritarianism as you have under Erdogan. You cannot have totalitarianism as you have today in Turkey. You must have maximum opportunity for civil society to express itself without terror, without fear of being arrested, detained, especially under the terrorism legislation. My colleague, the special rapporteur on human rights while countering terrorism, has already issued press releases concerning the abuse of the terrorism legislation in Turkey. But this is a matter of concern for many of the United Nations rapporteurs. I already mentioned the rapporteur on terrorism, but certainly my colleague, whom I've known for many years, Diego Garcia Sayan, he has been particularly active in examining the situation in Turkey and in condemning the corruption of the administration of justice in Turkey. Of course, part of the strategy, if you want, in trying to get some change in Turkey is what we call naming and shaming, and that entails dissemination of information about the situation that obtains today in Turkey. It is necessary that, for instance, the special rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression actually make a visit of Turkey. It is necessary that the special rapporteur on peaceful assembly and peaceful association visit Turkey. It is necessary that the rapporteur on the right to privacy visit Turkey. All of that is possible if and when there is a perceived need in the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution to this effect. The problem being is that the mainstream media has failed to live up to its watchdog function. We don't know enough about the situation in Turkey. Of course, you can find it in the internet. If you are an eager beaver, you can go on the internet and you can yourself find the information. On the other hand, you don't read it in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. You know, I live here in Switzerland. You don't read it in the Tribune de Genève. You don't read it in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. You don't read it in the New York Times or in the Washington Post. So in order to get, shall we say, traction, in order to have the Human Rights Council put this on the agenda, you have to inform people. So this webinar in itself is a very positive step in the right direction. But then you also have to keep in mind realpolitik. The Europeans have made a lot of money selling arms to Turkey. So has the United States. And there where economic interests exist, that has as a consequence that human rights concerns are not a priority. And notwithstanding all of the lip service that we give to human rights, economic considerations usually take a precedence over that. Notwithstanding, civil society demands change. And I was thinking in terms of the mechanisms that we have, because the not only the victims, not only those who have been personally affected by the abuses in Turkey, but also all persons concerned with human rights should be writing to their newspapers, to their senators, to their congressmen, congresswomen, etc., to the United Nations, to the European Court of Human Rights, to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. Michelle Bachelet sent to Erdogan a very concrete letter with very concrete proposals. That was in December. On the 4th of December, 2020. And there she makes some, pragmatic recommendations that I would like to see picked up. You can get, by the way, all of these documents if you go on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, www.ohchr.org. You go Turkey, and then you will get on the Turkey page, you will get the list. When was the last UPR, but also when the reports were submitted under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Committee Against Torture, the Committee on Migrant Workers, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, etc., etc. You also see who were the last special rapporteurs who visited the country. As I said, it is very important to have as many United Nations rapporteurs go on the ground and speak to the ministers and speak to Erdogan, etc. I see, according to the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I see the most recent special procedures reports, the rapporteur on torture, that was 2018, and the rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression, 2017, the working group on enforced disappearances, 2016, etc. So you have to keep on this pressure, and I would really encourage all those who are listening, go on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, click on complaints procedures, and then you can forward to the Human Rights Council a general complaint about the situation, but you can also target it, send communications to the Human Rights Committee, to the Committee Against Torture, etc., etc. I have as I say, a hope. That was also my experience as independent expert. When I did a country visit, I was actually non-confrontational. I did not try to, shall we say, insult the government. It's not my business to insult any government. I wanted to, tell the government, look, you do have a problem and you know it. I mean, let us help you. Let us give you advisory services and technical assistance. Let us examine how the rule of law can be restored in your country without necessarily entailing regime change. Sometimes people think that the only way to change things is regime change. You can have an evolution, but what is crucial is to demand of Erdogan several things. One, the release of all political prisoners. Secondly, the reinstatement of the professional judicial class, of the judges, of the prosecutors who were dismissed, the reinstatement of professors and teachers in their former functions. That is something that, unfortunately, the Europeans have tolerated. Obviously, there is an occasional decision by the European Court of Human Rights. I have here, for instance, one that was the case of Selahattin Demirtas against Turkey. And here, obviously, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights found that the trial of Selahattin Demirtas was contrary to Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights, etc. But it should be just one case. It should be hundreds, it should be thousands of cases before the European Court of Human Rights, and also before the Human Rights Committee. It's actually surprising that Turkey not only ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it also ratified the optional protocol, thereby recognizing the competence of the Human Rights Committee, secretary of which I used to be, to examine individual complaints against Turkey. So all I can say to our listeners is, for heaven's sake, use these procedures. In the European system, you need a lawyer to present a case, but the European Court of Human Rights will provide legal assistance, will provide a lawyer to present the case. In the case of the Human Rights Committee, we don't have the means to subsidize authors, and that's why we don't require that complaints be submitted by a lawyer. Any victim can present a case to the Human Rights Committee without the assistance of a lawyer. Obviously, it's helpful if you have a lawyer, because he will then frame the case according to the various articles of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But there are mechanisms available to you, and you really should use them. And other than that, I'm available for any questions. If you have specific questions, we still have a good 10 minutes. So Wendy, anytime you're ready, I'm ready.
Thank you very much for that. I do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind answering my questions. You were talking about the UN rapporteurs going into Turkey, the various list of different offices that send them. Is the Erdogan administration not cooperating with them when they go, or are we just not going as often as we need to?
Yeah, well, they're not enough of them asking to go. Obviously, any rapporteur, say the rapporteur on torture, it must be, shall we say, her initiative to ask for an invitation. When I went on mission to Ecuador and Venezuela, it was I who initiated it. That is, I wrote to the government and say, I would like to visit and examine a number of issues that were within my remit, were within my mandate. So in order for, say, the rapporteur on human rights while countering terrorism, for her to be convinced that she should give priority to this, it is important that victims write to her. It is important. I mean, the rapporteur now on terrorism is a professor of law in Ireland. Her name is Fionnuala Ní-O'Laighean. It's a difficult name to pronounce. As the case may be, you find it in the website of the office, www.ohchr.org. And the rapporteur on the independence of the judiciary, as you all know, is Diego Garcia Sayan from Peru. I know him well. And last time he was here, we had lunch together, and we talked about the problems in Turkey specifically. He has given several very interesting interviews, which you can find in the internet. And he, for instance, was also shocked by the fact that, for instance, the president of the European Court of Human Rights giving a talk in Turkey about the rule of law and accepting an award. He was awarded an honorary doctorate. I mean, you cannot accept an award from an institution that has dismissed professors and teachers, etc., because of their political opinions or whatever. It is shocking. You ask yourself, where did this judge leave his brains? Because it's not something that you would do. It's unethical. It is unconscionable because it compromises your credibility. And the problem with Europe is that Europe is being blackmailed by Erdogan. It's been blackmailed on the issue of migrants and refugees. But also there's so much business. There's so much trade with Turkey that the Europeans give lip service to human rights. But then when it comes to telling Erdogan, we will not continue doing business with you unless you restore the rule of law, they keep quiet about it. It is what I said before, the mainstream media in Europe, whether it be the Times of London, whether it be the Economist, whether it be the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, whether it be Le Monde, or whether it be Le Figaro, or whether it be the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, they treat Erdogan very nicely. And it's shocking. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be, but it is. And of course, if there's not a feeling in the general population that Turkey is a matter of concern, that Turkey is a country that is violating the European Convention on Human Rights day in, day out. It is violating the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations. I mean, whether it be Article 6 or 7 or 9 or 14 or 19, 21, 22, 25, it's a whole slew of violations, and it's like people don't care. I mean, it's for me, who's devoted more than 40 years of my life to human rights in various capacities, as president of an NGO, as professor of law, as secretary of the Human Rights Committee, or as independent expert. I am dismayed. I am really saddened by the recognition of so much hypocrisy, so much, I mean, I dare say there's a human rights industry that simply uses the jargon of human rights, but does not change anything. So, I mean, you need more activists on the streets, more people who demand it and demonstrate. And as I say, I have not seen a lot of good sense in the mainstream media in Europe. And there's even talk now that maybe discussions for the possible entry of Turkey in the European Union, that they want to open negotiations on membership.
Yes, I mean, that was my next question. That was my next question, was whether or not the authoritarianism that's going on right now has actually sounded the death knell to them being entered into the EU, which was previously Erdogan's his goal. So is that now over, or as you're just now saying, for some reason this doesn't seem to be an issue anymore?
If there were logic in this whole affair, other than money, if you are committed to so-called European values, and that means the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, if you are committed to human rights, you cannot possibly even consider that a country where the rule of law has broken down, like in Turkey, could even consider entering the European Union. I mean, you have a country where you have a witch hunt. You have a country where we have witnessed purges that make you think of the purges of intellectuals and professors and judges and military in the Stalinist period in the 1930s. That's what you have in Turkey today. You have purges and witch hunts. I mean, that is totally incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. It's totally incompatible with the Treaty of Lisbon. Article 2 of the Treaty of Lisbon obliges all member states to observe, promote, protect human rights. That's exactly what's missing in Turkey. But the press is not telling you that. You have to go sometimes to the alternative media to find out what's going on in Turkey, because you don't read it in the pages of the New York Times.
That is correct. That is correct. I hate to say that we've run out of time. We need to move on to the next speaker because it's very fascinating, this dichotomy that we have now with how sort of everyone's blinded to what before seemed to be their goal was to get human rights and constitutional rights in Turkey. And that was the precipitous to, or the barrier to getting into the EU. And now it just seems to be not a non-issue. And I agree with you that it does seem to have a lot to do with trade and also the number of people from Turkish descent who are living in EU countries, and whether or not they might overrun the EU countries and they're concerned about. I really appreciate that you have joined us, and thank you so much for your participation. I am going to move on to our next speaker. We may have some more questions later, but thank you so much. Enjoy Switzerland.
Thank you, Wendy. I will mute myself.
Excellent, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Tayyip Aydin. For more than 20 years, he was a judge in Turkey's civil and criminal courts. At one point, he was the head of human rights for the Ministry of Justice in Turkey. Thankfully, he was in the US obtaining his PhD when he was purged from his position after the coup attempt. He subsequently obtained that PhD from Penn State in 2018. He is still in the United States, and he now acts as an advisor to several human rights organizations that are active in addressing the human rights abuses in Turkey. Today, he's going to outline some of Erdogan's most egregious abuses of power in the president's blatant efforts to consolidate his authoritarian regime. Dr. Aydin, are you ready? Dr. Aydin, sorry. I keep mispronouncing your name. I apologize.
Good pronunciation. Hi, Wendy. Unfortunately, in order to make it more clear, I would like to give some background information and context what's going on in Turkey. And definitely the Turkish situation is a good example of the nexus between the corruption and the human rights violations. So for me, it started with the corruption investigation in 2013, where then the Prime Minister Erdogan's family and the cabinet members revealed that the bribery and smuggling violations of the United Nations sanctions against Iran. So instead of permitting the investigation to proceed, and as expected, Erdogan framed the coup attempt by the judiciary against the elected government. So that narrative was accepted by the Erdogan followers. And he saw the judiciary, independent judiciary, as a big threat to, as a corrupt government. And he directly targeted independent judiciary. As you know that the main pillars of the democracy, two main pillars of the democracy is one, the free media, and another is the independent judiciary. Unfortunately, in today's Turkey, two pillars don't exist anymore. And therefore, after the corruption cases, and he directly attacked the judiciary, some legislative changes were made, and he managed to capture the judiciary's structural institutions. And by doing so, he created his own judicial system, unfortunately. And today, in Turkey's court and judicial system is a tool for gross human rights violations, and including the crime against humanity, unfortunately. So it was after getting the power of judicial system, and he created his own special courts. So these courts were tasked with fighting against the opponents, especially the Gülen movement was the main target. He was accusing the movement for the corruption investigations. And these special courts were specifically designed. All the members were appointed from the government-related persons, loyalists. So they are not tasked with delivering justice. Their function, they are tasked with fighting the so-called enemies of the states. So the people were appointed for that course has a fundamentalist mindset, if I say. They think that they are fighting against the infidels and traitors, and they are directly getting order from the Erdogan and ruling party. And so it's not possible to make them believe the truth. And they know that they know everything, but they insist on doing the gross human rights violations in Turkey now. And after the corruption case, and by capturing the judiciary and media, Erdogan started to frame the main political rival, meaning the Gülen movement, framing it as a terrorist organization. We are so familiar with that type of rhetoric, and every time authoritarian regimes use the criminal justice system and anti-terror law as a tool to oppress the opponents. So it was the case, it has been the case for Turkey, and the movement was framed and named as terrorist organizations, armed terrorist organizations. But initially it was very difficult for the Erdogan to do that. Basically, for three reasons. And one of them is that formerly movement, some accusations, similar accusations were made against the movement, and infiltrating the state structure and capturing the state. All the allegations were dismissed by the highest court of the Turkish criminal court, with the res judicata, meaning same type of allegations shouldn't be brought before the courts. It was the first difficulty for the Erdogan. The second one, just before the corruption case, Erdogan and ruling party members were praising the movement for their contribution to the education and Turkish state structure. They were actively participating in their fundraising activities, and their children. They were sending their children to the Gülen movement related schools. So that was another problem the Erdogan had. Thirdly, maybe the biggest problem they had, the movement was opposing the violence and the extremism. They were defending the peace and dialogue, and they are directly against the violence. So Fethullah Gülen was telling that a terrorist cannot be Muslim and Muslim cannot be a terrorist. And therefore, and also the movement was the directly opposite of the extremist mindset, and that the Erdogan was coming. So ironically, the movement, therefore Erdogan started to name the movement illegal organization, and then after capturing the state structure and the judiciary, and it turned into that to name them as terrorist organizations. So as a political rival, we saw that, we have seen that civil society organizations was turned into armed terrorist organizations without any violence, without any gun, without anything, just the political, being a political rival, made them as the terrorist organizations. Now, in tandem with that, the criminalization process, and also we have witnessed a very intensive demonization process in Turkey, and we witnessed 3 years after the corruption case till before the coup attempt, and media platforms related to the Erdogan media platforms repeated the same type of arguments and demonized, dehumanized the movement supporters. And it was directly orchestrated by the Erdogan, and international legal communities have determined more than 240 hate speech being used by the Erdogan. So we have witnessed organized, state-organized and crime against humanity towards a targeted group, meaning the Gülen movement in that case. Unfortunately, as working group of arbitrary detention determined more than 20 cases that Erdogan regime is abusing Turkish judicial system, and the working group determined that all the detentions and arrest, detention, and convictions are made against the fundamental human rights. Reasons for the arrest and detentions, not only the legal activities, but also fundamental human rights, which are protected by the relevant conventions. And working group recalled that the mass arrest and detention against the international law may constitute crime against humanity. And unfortunately, these gross human rights violations are carried out, are realized by the so-called judiciary. Just to make it more clear, I would like to give an example how the gross human rights violations are organized by the state to show that issue. After the coup attempt and the torture allegations were very spread, and European Council of Committee of this torture, CPT committee, was coming to Turkey as a fact-finding mission. And before the committee is coming, an official document was leaked to press. And according to that document, a national police department sent a confidential letter to the police units in all 81 provinces and instructing them to hide, to obscure the traces of the torture in detention center, and then not to use unofficial detention centers. And it's a clear-cut indication that in today's Turkey, and torture is a state-organized crime. And therefore, all the domestic remedies to disclose the torture and human rights violations doesn't exist because it is carried out by the state. So, as an example, for the demonization and scapegoating, as the moment we're dealing with dialogue and defending the cooperation with other religions, it was easy for the Erdogan to frame them infidels and traitors. So the one rhetoric was that the movement was the puppets of the foreign governments. And we had a very long list, in short, including the United States, puppets of the United States and European Union, and Israel, Jewish lobby, and Mossad, CIA, including ISIS. And so these propaganda, Erdogan's propaganda machine has worked very well. And a connection was created between the Turkish society's mind and the evilness of the targeted group, Gülen movement. So, but it wasn't enough to carry out the gross human rights violations. They needed another action, which is the coup attempt, organized by the Erdogan regime. So it was planned, it was pre-planned and put into practice. After that, a state of emergency was declared. By doing that, all the state of emergency enabled Turkish government to suspend all rule of the law and all legal principles, including presumption of the innocence, and there is no crime without law, and individuality of the crime and punishment were abolished as under the pretext of fighting the terrorism. So derogations were made, and torturers, when we look at the degrees law and changes made by the degrees law, we saw the clear intention of the Turkish government's torture intention. So it was the detention period was extended from the 4 days to 30 days. And for the first 5 days, it wasn't possible to have to see the lawyer, and choosing their own lawyer was prohibited. And all the prisons mechanism and overseeing mechanism were repealed. And as Human Rights Watch report shows that the report title was the blank check to the torture. Exactly, Erdogan regime gave a blank check to the torturers to get the confessions, because as they don't as they don't have any evidence against the movement, all the plan was based on taking the evidence under the torture and then transferring these statements to the relevant courts and prosecutors to initiate the criminal procedure, including all the torturers are provided with the immunities, and it was in one example in Zonguldak province, and the victims told that their torturers that they would bring the complaint against them, and the police officers were telling that, and you can't do anything to us. We have 30 days, and we are told by the public prosecutors that you are good. As long as they walk, you can do whatever you want. So there is therefore, and in today's Turkey, judiciary and public prosecutors are covering up the traces of the torture, and any action in favor of the victims can easily be framed assisting the terrorism. It can easily be framed in that way. Therefore, even the people trying to raise the money for the victims' families, and for the children in need, were arrested for the assisting of the terrorism. If you are a judge and if you give a decision in favor of the victims, you can easily be named terrorist and purged and convicted and dismissed. So it is the rule. Turkish government has a magical formula, turning every legal action, every fundamental rights into, let's say, terrorism activities. So unfortunately, international community should see that point and act accordingly. And for my understanding, it's very difficult to change the Erdogan's regime mindset because they are manipulating the system. They are trying to gain time, and they are playing with the international community. Therefore, we need to see that situation and act accordingly.
Thank you, Dr. Aden. I actually have a couple of questions. So you were one of the judges that was subject to the purge. Do we have any idea how many judges were actually purged?
Yeah, it's increasing, unfortunately. And initially it was around 2,750, and then now it's around 500,000, and it's increasing. When some judges are giving the decision in favor of the law, and these judges are also added to the list of the purge and purged and then detained. Unfortunately, it is initially 1/3 of the whole judiciary was dismissed in Turkey.
And as you say, sorry, I was coughing. As you say, if you're a judge and you have one of these cases before you, the options are decide what the Erdogan government wants you to, or be subject to arrest and detention yourself, or purge. And of course, purge, you're not in prison, but purge is pretty bad because you then are not employable. So I guess how is that even, there is no rule of law at this point because everyone is subject to the corruption of having their decisions decided for them, by pressure. I'm wondering when we're looking at some of these cases where people are being brought up on charges and that sort of thing before the judiciary. We talked in the introduction that there were problems with the private attorneys who are, of course, also being threatened. They could be arrested or purged for representing the people who are being charged, which is just the complete opposite of what rule of law is. So are the people who are being charged even able to get representation in Turkey, or are they needing to obtain outside of Turkey counsel to even make any headway with their case? I'm just wondering, is the deck stacked against everyone in this, what Dr. Dizzaz considered to be a witch hunt? Is there no hope for the people who are called terrorists? Is it simply you are called a terrorist and then you are summarily taken over to jail and that's it? What is the recourse for stopping that accusation to jail pipeline?
Yes, thank you for remembering it. It is the another big problem as the right to defense is completely out of question in Turkey, especially the targeted groups. So more than 297 lawyers have been convicted for the membership of the terrorist organization. Reason for that, it was underlined by the United Nations High Commissioner's Office. That pattern was determined by them, and in every single case, these convicted lawyers just defended their clients as a requirement of their professions. But in today's Turkey, and Erdogan government needs a lawyer to make the accused accept their crimes. And you are not, as a lawyer, you are not supposed to help your client, but help the Erdogan regime to make collaborative with the regime to be a confessor. Therefore, it's very dangerous to accept those type of cases. The fees, lawyers' fees, are 10 times higher than the normal cases. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a structural, and for me, there is no state in Turkey, just a criminal organization using the state structure for their benefits. And it started with the corruption cases. And that corruption made the beautiful country into miserable places. I don't know how to repair it, but it will take a long time after the regime has gone.
Do we know at this point, and we have 2 minutes left, but do we know at this point how many are still incarcerated?
Are you asking lawyers?
Lawyers, so anyone
Yeah.
for like the judiciary system?
Yeah. I think that more than, the numbers are not exact, but more than 1,000 in unbelievable judges and prosecutors in jail, and most of them are in the single cells in communicator situation, and lawyers, at least if I'm not mistaken, 600 lawyers have been detained so far. And also, if that lawyers are defended by the bar associations, and bar associations are also targeted, and after the coup attempt, I think 34 bar associations were shut down. So everybody know the rules, and they how to play the game, and people don't cross their lines as they defend their clients.
Well, as an attorney, that is probably the saddest thing that I have heard, because being able to have access to justice is fundamental to the freedoms that all of the other freedoms that people enjoy. The freedom of speech, the freedom of having free press, those types of things are all precipitated by the fact that you have access to the courts and to justice in order to write your grievances. So that is very sad to me, and I'm sorry that you were one of the victims of that purge as well. We're very happy to have you in the United States. So we're happy about that, but we're very, very sorry that you were one of those purged people from your position. And we certainly think about those people who are still in Turkey, who are being persecuted even to this day. I thank you, Dr. Aden, for being a part of our conference. We need to move on to the next speaker, but I will certainly let you know if we have any further questions.
Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, everyone, our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Skubic. He earned his PhD from Australian National University and his law degree from UCLA. He retired as an international lawyer and professor of law, ethics, and humanities, and he has worked and lectured around the globe on such issues as constitutional, administrative, and international law, professional and business ethics, and also interfaith and interreligious dialogue and cooperation. Today, he's going to discuss how independence and discretion either enhances or undermines the rule of law, and what that might mean in Turkey's current political climate. Dr. Skubic, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Wendy. Very grateful to be with you all today. Let me share my screen. Oh dear. Sorry for the delay. See, is my screen sharing? There we go. Thank you. Okay. We speak quite a bit about the rule of law, as well as using terms like independence of the judiciary and discretion of leaders, both political leaders, judicial, and other officials. I'd like to provide a bit of an analytic framework for discussing the rule of law and exactly what independence discretion means, and then what that suggests for an analysis of what's happening in Turkey, to put what, in part, what Professor Dizzaz and now Professor Aden have presented to us. So what exactly is the rule of law? Let me begin by reminding us of a quote from Shakespeare's Henry VI over 400 years ago. Part of the dialogue from a fellow who's labeled Dick the Butcher in this play, Henry VI by Shakespeare. First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. And it's often today taken to be an almost humorous aside, but what we need to look at is that in context of the play, what Shakespeare is referring to, or what we can take him to be referring to, is not just lawyers specifically, but more generally what it means for there to be a rule of law, what it means for there to be judges and lawyers who stand in the way of autocrats who would seek to have their will. So when we speak of the rule of law, we want to look both at some conceptual and some empirical or practical matters that help us think about what it means for there to be the rule of law present or the rule of law absent in a society. First, to speak of the rule of law is to say that there's a sovereign, and that can be an individual or it can be a collective body. And it's understood that that sovereign, a political sovereign, has a monopoly of coercive power in a society. Anyone can exercise coercive power just by carrying around a weapon, but to have legitimate coercive power, to be recognized as that body or that individual with legitimate coercive power, is to say that that legitimacy, our understanding of its permissibility, its not just being allowed, but it's being recognized as desirable, is that it's grounded upon and subject to some widely shared definition and application of the rule of law. And that includes that there is discretion, although that discretion is bounded both by political leaders and those within the judicial system, judges and lawyers alike, and that the sovereign itself is subject to this rule of law. The sovereign is not above the law, the sovereign is subject to the law. So what are some of the basic criteria to say that there's a rule of law in place? Well, first, that the legislature, and again, that's whether it's an individual or a collective body, the legislature makes a public prospective rule. It is public, not secret. It is prospective, that is, it looks to the future and future behavior, not to actions that are already taken. So the legislator can't tell me today that what I did yesterday is unlawful and then punish me for it. It has to be prospective behavior, and it has to be a public law, one that I can know about, not one that's kept close to the chest, not one that's made in secret and not published. There has to be some level of certainty to that law. That is, when I read that law, I have to be able to ascertain whether I am being addressed by that law or not, and what behavior is sanctioned by that law. And when I say the behavior is sanctioned, I mean two different things. In English, sanction is an interesting word because it has both a positive meaning of that which is permitted, and it has a negative meaning of that which is punished. So I have to have some certainty about whether I am being addressed and whether particular behavior is permitted or is punishable. And then, of course, it has to be stable. It can't be changing. A rule that changes day by day can't guide my behavior. And so it needs to be relatively stable. Changes can be made, but they have to be made over the longer span of time. They can't be changing day by day, week by week. And then once again, these rules have to be applicable to all, not just some. Some common additional criteria is that the law must cohere with constitutional limitations on lawmaking. Those constitutional limitations mean that the legislator must have some constitutional authorization to make a law that deals with the particular matters at issue. It doesn't matter if it's public and prospective, it also has to fall under the constitutional limitations. Also, the laws must cohere with the constitutional rights that are accorded to its citizens, and laws that don't cohere with those constitutional rights, just like laws that don't cohere with constitutional limitations, are illegitimate. The laws must also cohere with universally recognized human rights. It's commonly recognized today that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, advanced back in 1948 after the establishment of the United Nations, provides a set of universally recognized human rights that need to be within the purview of the legislator when the laws are being made. And then finally, again, government officials themselves are bound by these laws that are enforced, and they are bound and can only enforce the laws that exist at the time of the enforcement. Once again, it's prospective. The laws established today that are used tomorrow, not laws that tell us today that some behavior in the past was unlawful and then seek to enforce them against citizens. Those are what we might call conceptual parameters or conceptual matters. There are also some pragmatic parameters, some practical parameters. How is it that we can assure that these conceptual matters are adhered to? How can we be certain that the constitutional limitations, that the human rights limitations, that the civil rights limitations, that the application to all are being adhered to? Well, first, the lawmaker cannot self-assess adherence to those laws. The governmental institution itself, like the legislator that makes the laws, can't itself decide whether it's abiding by those limiting criteria that we just outlined. That creates serious conflicts of interest on behalf of the legislator. So there needs to be a separate body, a separate institution, another and an independent governmental institution that takes on the task of determining the legitimacy of the laws and their application in actual cases. And this is the task that's commonly given to the judicial system. This means that judiciary is critical to manage the relationship between the government and its citizens, what is sometimes called the vertical legal relationship, as well as the relationship between citizens, what is sometimes called the horizontal relationship within the judicial system. For laws apply between the legislator and the citizens, and also between one citizen and another. And the judicial system must manage both of those relationships. To do that, the judicial officials must be independent. That is, their jobs must not be tied to pleasing the legislator or citizens, so that they can exercise their critical faculties in determining whether, in fact, the law and its application is legitimate. And they must have sufficient discretion. It is bounded discretion, but they must have sufficient discretion to interpret the law when the specific range and application of the law is insufficiently clear or uncertain in a particular case, in an individual case. And this generally happens because natural human languages are themselves rather ambiguous. Terms do not refer very simply to one sort of fact or factual circumstance or relationship. And so there has to be some level of discretion that's accorded to the judicial officers to determine whether the terms of legislation actually applies to this person in this particular case, given particularized behavior. Now, when any of these criteria or parameters, whether they're the analytic, the conceptual parameters, or whether they're these pragmatic parameters are violated, we have an undermining of the rule of law. Wherever we have a systematic violation of these parameters, conceptual or pragmatic, we actually defeat the rule of law. We would say there is, in fact, no rule of law in that society. Well, that's quite a bit of conceptual and even pragmatic considerations to keep in mind. But what does this mean for specific regimes, specific countries? And what does it mean in particular for Turkey? The World Justice Project is an international non-governmental organization and research institute which since 2008 established a rule of law index, and since 2008 provides an annual survey of countries around the world. The most recent survey was just published for 2020. And in the 2020 survey, the WJP determined that Turkey, out of 128 countries surveyed, Turkey was 107th. And this is on a ranking where rank number 1 means there is the closest adherence to the conceptual and pragmatic parameters of the rule of law, and 128 means the least committed, the least presence of the rule of law in that regime, in that country. Turkey was ranked 107 out of 128. In relation to some specific factors that the World Justice Project uses, like constraints on government powers, Turkey ranked 124 out of 128. In relation to fundamental rights, it ranked 123 out of 128. In relation to regulatory enforcement, 110 out of 128. And in relation to civil rights, 103 out of 128. In fact, on all the basic 8 criteria used by the World Justice Project, Turkey scored below the global averages on all 8 criteria. And what does that mean specifically for attacks on the judicial system? As we already heard from Professor Aydin, since July 2016, Turkish authorities have dismissed over 160,000 public servants, and that includes over 4,200 judicial officers, and that's judges and prosecutors within the system. They have detained over 2,500 judicial officers, have prosecuted over 1,500 lawyers, and of those, 450 or more than 450 have been sentenced under terrorism statutes and have been given enhanced sentences. I would refer you to a book recently published by Bülent Keniş, who is previously of Turkey and was able to flee, recently published A Genocide in the Making, ? Where he reviews a number of the issues that are being raised by Professor Dizzaz and Professor Aydin in their talks this morning. And so we can see that moving from conceptual and pragmatic matters to facts on the ground, to analyses of the World Justice Project and those who are looking in from the outside, and those on the inside who have experienced persecution under the Erdogan regime, we see that indeed the rule of law is not only under stress, but one might go so far as to say that the rule of law is non-existent. Just as a closing matter, let me say that while this has been basically an analytic presentation, I'm drawn to this analytic presentation in large measure because of the relationships that my wife and myself have developed with a number of Hizmet members over the years. We've had the privilege of traveling, and I've had the privilege of teaching in Turkey, and we are indeed gravely distressed to find such a quick downhill slide in Turkey, in relationship between persons and in relationship between the regime and those whom we so dearly love. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you may have.
Yes, I'm here. And Dr. Skubic, if you will stop sharing your screen, I think then we'll be able to see your face.
Oh dear. I'm sorry. Oh, here we are. Sorry.
There we are.
There we go.
There we are. Thank you. Mostly I have just a comment about what you spoke, because it kind of dovetails with what several other of our panelists have talked about. This independence and, as you discussed, discretion has pretty much been destroyed, as far as I can tell from the other panelists, because as we just talked with Dr. Aiden, if the judiciary and the lawyers working within the system cannot work independently of what they're being told to do, then that whole entire system has collapsed. So I understand what you've said is that there really is no rule of law at this point. What would be one of the steps that would be necessary to get us back on track in Turkey?
Well, that is a good question, a very large question. It would begin, I think, with helping reestablish some independence of the judiciary. But here, the question was previously raised by Professor Dizzaz. It doesn't necessarily require regime change to see that human rights are being recognized. But in this particular case, since there has been a wholesale replacement of the judiciary within Turkey, at least that's my understanding, and certainly from the testimony of others at this conference today, then it would seem that something like a regime change, if not a replacement of President Erdogan, at least a wholesale replacement of the judiciary, and that means not just judges, but prosecutors as well, who indeed are willing to exercise independent judgment so that cases are fairly and rightly brought according to laws that follow the criteria of the rule of laws we've laid out here. I'm honestly not sure how that can practically be done without a significant change at the top of the governmental system.
Okay. I was wondering about, when you were talking about the World Justice Report, do we know, there's probably statistics on what Turkey's standing was prior to the coup attempt in 2016? I know that there were always constitutional issues that the EU were pressing Turkey to change because of, in order to gain entrance into the EU. And some of those things were being changed, and that's before he won the presidency that second time with the landslide. And then we had the coup attempt in 2016. So where was Turkey on that scale before the coup? Do you know?
Both yes and no. And what I mean is that the World Justice Project has been slightly altering, or sometimes making some major revisions to the way it asks questions and analyzes the responses that it receives from its surveys. What it attempts to do, perhaps if people are also familiar with Transparency International, it's much the same process. You survey professionals and high-ranking citizens, both within a country, of what their perspectives are, and of others on the outside that have regular relationship with those on the inside the country. What are their perspectives on these various measures of civil rights, fundamental rights, and so on? Since the questions have changed a bit over time, it can be difficult to say that there is a rank 5 years ago that is comparable to the ranking today, and so we can tell whether the country has moved up or down. What we can say is that given the reports over time, Turkey has never been high on the global rank. It has never shown itself to be particularly strongly committed to the rule of law according to the criteria used by the World Justice Project. What is interesting is that the WJP also does regional rankings as well as global rankings. And within the region that Turkey has been placed, Turkey was near the top of its regional ranking, even though the region itself, globally speaking, was relatively low on the rule of law index. And now Turkey has dropped even within that regional ranking, so that it is now moved from the top to the middle and now near the bottom, not only of the regional ranking, but of the global ranking itself. If you go on the World Justice Project website, you can find all the reports going back to 2008, which was the year of their pilot project, and see where any particular country that it was ranked in any given year, what the criteria were and where the country ranked.
So for a country like Turkey that was more Western leaning originally before the second administration of Erdogan, I'm thinking of you talking about the regional ranking having fallen. Was this being compared, I'm assuming, to the Asian side? So this being compared to countries like Iraq and Syria and Iran, or was it being compared to some of the former Soviet republics above it? Do you know what the region was?
Yeah, the region is both. It is Middle East, Central Asia. And so we are talking about some of the former Soviet republics, the Stans, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on, as well as countries in the Middle Eastern region.
Okay.
So that gives some sense of how there has been a decline in the ranking over time since the WJP began.
Well, I really appreciate you being with us today, Dr. Skubic. I will let you know if we have any further questions, but for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skubic. Okay, I'm very excited for our next speaker. Attorney James Harrington is a human rights attorney here in the United States. He is founder of the Texas Civil Rights Project. He served as executive director of that project until 2016. He's previously an adjunct professor of civil rights at the University of Texas Law School and has been a member of several human rights delegations. For instance, Chile, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and to both Israel and Palestinian territories. He's an author and international speaker on civil rights. I had the opportunity of meeting him once in Chicago at a similar conference to this, back when we were all able to meet in conferences in person before the pandemic. But as an attorney, I followed his work with respect to Turkey for quite a while, and I'm very honored to have this opportunity to introduce him to you. Attorney Harrington, are you ready to go?
I am, Wendy. It's really nice to see you. Thank you for the nice introduction.
All right, I'm going to bow out and let you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And first of all, I want to give thanks to Howard University for sponsoring this, because Howard University, apart from being the alma mater of our new vice president, our first African-American and Asian vice president, is also the home to many, many distinguished human rights advocates and jurists. Thurgood Marshall, for example, one of the premier justices for human rights on our Supreme Court, is a graduate of Howard University Law School and spent 24 years on the Supreme Court. But prior to that, he was a leader in going about the desegregation of America's brand of apartheid. And Pauli Murray is another one who was a collaborator with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who eventually joined the Supreme Court, is also an alumna of Howard University. So I Howard for doing this and continuing its role in human rights, because often what become law in the United States, or at least what become our ideals in terms of human rights, resonate around the world and often inspire other countries and activists in other countries. So I'm really honored to be today. So as Wendy mentioned, my history has been a human rights attorney. I've also been in academia, but human rights attorney on the ground. And on the ground for me means that working with people deepening human rights in our country, but also with the idea of extending this and influencing other similar co-workers and activists in other parts of the world. And my introduction to Turkey is totally by happenstance. I happened to be in church one morning, and one of my friends, a judge, said, we're going to Turkey. We're putting together an interfaith group. Would anybody like to go? And I thought, well, you know, I got some vacation time. I've never been to Turkey. I've always been curious about it. And off I went with our group. And it was a really interesting and enlightening trip for somebody who grew up with, of course, the institutional biases in our country about Turkey, about Islam, about Muslims. And after I came back, as a lawyer, I had become interested in Fethullah Gulen and the legal issues that he went through while he was in Turkey. And so when I came back, I ended up actually sitting down to write a book about the trials and tribulations and the rule of law in Turkey and how it had worked against and for Fethullah Gulen, because all of this, his encounters with the legal system began before and after, and continued after what I'm going to call sort of the judicial renaissance of the year 2000. And so it really introduced me to the legal system in Turkey and piqued my interest in the potential of Turkey to become a leader, particularly in that part of the world. And that was a view shared by Americans, of course, generally and hopefully. And Turkey, of course, was one of the first places that Barack Obama visited after he became president, because it was during this period, this golden period, I'll call it, when Turkey was readjusting to the responses and suggestions and urgings, to put it nicely, of the European Union. And so what I got to see through writing this book and following what happened afterwards, in fact, I went back after everything began to shutter down because of Erdogan and wrote a report on the state of human rights in Turkey. But what I began to see in that writing that book was that the legal system that existed up until, I'm going to just use 2000 as the demarcation here, was very much like the legal system that Erdogan has reestablished. It did nothing but do whatever the government wanted and in the way the government wanted it. There was no rule of law vis-a-vis the legal system at that time. Of course, it always dealt with the regular day-to-day stuff that goes on, you know, landlord to tenant, marriage, all of that kind of stuff. But in anything that was vaguely, potentially political, and political is widely defined, as we've already discussed today, was subject to the courts reinforcing, backing, and implementing whatever it is that the government wanted. So when one of the amazing things that the European Union did in this period, let's say between 2000 and 2010, 2015, was to undergo this massive training potential for judges in Turkey to visualize and implement an independent judiciary. This was very important, of course. And the European Union trained thousands and thousands of judges, not only in Turkey, but had judges go to other countries to be part of, perhaps get academic degrees, but to learn from other countries and how their judicial systems function. So I was really interested when I was writing the book. I went back and interviewed people all around the country, but I was really, really interested as a lawyer in interviewing the judges. And I also then went back later on with a delegation of judges and attorneys, judges here, appellate judges here in Texas, and trial judges and attorneys. And in my meetings, so we're going to kind of divide this into two. So my first set of meetings was trial judges and prosecutors. And of course, the system in Turkey is a little bit different. It's the European model than the model that we have in the United States. But the principles are the same in terms of striving for an independent judiciary and in propping up the rule of law, which involves, in my view, and I think everybody would agree, involves the independence and the check on government. So when I say the check on government, this is a concept that is relatively new in our human history. Typically, the judiciary judges have always been a function of the king or the executive or whatever you want to call it, whoever happened to be ruling the country, the military in Turkey's case. But the United States began in 1803, and 1803 is an important date here. I want to come back to this, don't let me forget. But beginning in 1803, we started to develop the idea that the judiciary had plenary power to determine the constitutionality or legality of what Congress or the executive, our president, were doing, and that was independent and untouchable, and that the judges had life tenure. They would serve until they either passed on, retired, or just decided, that they didn't want to be a judge anymore. Neither the Congress nor the executive, the president, could do anything to touch the careers of the judges. So that concept then, of course, has become a concept that any of us in human rights law or civil rights law abide by. And it was interesting to talk to judges and prosecutors in Turkey during this time who were getting acquainted with this idea and how seriously they were taking their role in this change that was going on. And I was struck by how, in fact, at least one judge continued to communicate with me regarding decisions that he was making. Now, how do you do this in the United States? Or how do you address this particular claim that comes up in terms of human rights? What would be your approach in the United States? So it was really quite inspiring to see that go on. And then when we back as a group, lawyers and judges, we actually met again with trial level. When I say trial level, that's the first instance, I think is the term that's often used in Europe. And we also met with the Constitutional Court, which of course is one of the most important, I would say the premier court in Turkey. And at that time, those judges also were going through this sort of metamorphosis of not being part of the functionaries of the government, or not being seen as functionaries of the government, but actually evaluating government action to deciding whether it's constitutional compliance with Turkey's laws Turkey's constitution. So that was that was really, it was inspiring to me, frankly, because these are the people who were trying to work out of the history of what we had seen in Turkey. In that process, went on for 10 years or more, as this professionalization, I'll call it, of the judiciary was going on. And it was ratified in many respects by that historic constitutional amendment referendum that happened in 2010 to further strengthen and put it in writing in the Constitution what we would consider progressive constitutional reforms, not only in terms of what human rights were or are, but also what the role of the judiciary would be in protecting them. And as was earlier mentioned by Professor Zayas, of course, is that Turkey long has ascribed to the European Court of Human Rights, subscribed but not necessarily implemented. And then how to roll all of this together. And so, this was just an amazing event to watch. People flew back, some were on pilgrimage, flew back just to vote to make these changes. And of course, then Erdogan begins to exercise and aggrandize and take power. And he recognizes that, as was pointed out in Shakespeare, that the last thing a despot wants is a civil society and independent judiciary. And then you have the constitutional amendments that he implemented in 2017, and all of the extra outside of constitutional activities that he did implemented in terms of punishing judges and transferring cases away from judges to his special courts for anybody he deemed was part of the coup. And what that really meant, of course, is any political opposition, any political opposition. And so in that process, then, of course, we have ended up, as we've described, and I'm not going to repeat the dreadful and awful statistics that we're familiar with about what has gone on in Turkey generally, but what has gone on with respect to the judicial system. We are dealing with a government, it is consummately corrupt. And part of its consummate corruption is to take away anybody that can challenge that power in any respect. And so, as was mentioned earlier, just a hint by a judge of disagreement with Erdogan will land you in jail or on the streets. Erdogan, with respect to the country, I would say, in the horrific torture that goes on, the persecution, the disemployment, the alienation of people from their work. Someone used Stalinist, I think Professor Zayas, Stalinist is a good word. And Stalinist, I think you can look at Erdogan as having established an internal 21st century gulag, a gulag that tortures people, punishes people, disenfranchises people, takes away their jobs, makes their lives miserable, forces them to go begging, all of that's terrible. And I don't want any of my comments to undermine the horror of what's going on. Sometimes when we make comments, we're talking about this sort of away from the situation, we get a bit academic. I'm speaking as an academic. We get a bit academic and we don't see the blood soil, the blood toil, tears and sweat, as Churchill would say. We don't see that in the day-to-day lives of people and how it ruins their lives simply because of one person's political agenda that would not exist if we had an independent judiciary in the country. So I think when I look at this, and then I look at what has the government done now. So the government, as we have talked about, and all the statistics, the reports there's so many excellent reports out there right now. so many excellent reports about what the government has done with regard to crippling and disestablishing the judiciary. I mean, it's not only on removing the judges, imprisoning the judges, threatening the judges, all of that, which is awful, but it's also who's taking their place. And so you have all of these young lawyers becoming judges who don't have a clue what it means to be a judge other than to be a functionary of the state. They don't have any experience, number one, in the day-to-day lives of people, but even if they did, it doesn't matter because all they're there is to be a token of a system that Erdogan can turn around and say, well, we got judges. You know, that kind of thing, that kind of nonsense that goes on. So you have sort of a qualitative and a quantitative dismantling of the judicial system. And Erdogan has been very effective at this. And part of it, as was pointed out earlier too by Professor Zayas, is by his adept blending of religion and state. So infidel and traitor are the same word. You know, and of course, one of the cardinal virtues of a human rights lawyer is there has to be separation of church and state. There has got to be. I mean, we're still wrestling with this in the United States, the role of religion in controlling government. But Erdogan's been very good at undermining institutions of civil society by blending infidel and traitor, you know, and to go about the de-secularization of the country that was accepted during the Renaissance period between 2000 and 2010 that had been actually begun, of course, by Ataturk, but was Europeanized, I would say, during that golden period, 2000 to 2010, right? And is to obliterate that, again, for his own political agenda. So the question then becomes, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? I have a slogan that logic never carries the day. This is never about logic. What it is always about power. So how do we deal with that? How do we get Turkey on track again? Is it possible? We have seen the potential in Turkey, the potential for change and professionalization, not just in the law, of course, but the professionalization that went on all across civil society, in education, everything was absolutely amazing. How do we get back to that? How do we get back to that? And I am of the view, being an organizer at heart, is that it does not happen. It does not happen until there is economic pressure brought on Turkey. Erdogan is never, ever going to wake up one morning and say, oh, you know what? Let's go back and move toward an independent judiciary. That is never going to happen. There has to be a change that we saw the world make with South Africa. The economic boycotts, the economic pressure. It has to go on the European Union, so they stop coddling Erdogan. It has to go on Turkey, right? It's a long, tedious process. But I don't think until the world, till we who are on the ground begin that organizing process, that there will be change. We have got to do that organizing. We can sit around if we want, and we can wring our hands, and we can lament. But as a famous organizer in the United States said, Mother Jones, organize, organize, organize. We saw it work in South Africa, and I am convinced it can work, but it's slow, tedious work, and that we have to do it. The one bright star for me, as I look at Turkey, is that they did go through that 10-year process. And that the lawyers and judges have seen a different world of legal society, of civil law, of civil society. I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to go back to the year 1803, when the United States Supreme Court said, we're independent. For us in the United States, who have lived with this for more than 200 years, this is still in process, still in progress, and has been a huge battle to have independent, professional judiciary. We're still fighting over this, but we have that. We now have tradition. We now have that tradition. So as imperfect and as radically imperfect, our system, as imperfect as it is, we still have institutionalized that value and that goal, and we often accomplish that, amazingly enough. To me, that's the hope of Turkey. Turkey is not blessed with that 200-year history that we had. They do have the 10 years. And I just hope, every day that I think about this and talk about this, that 10 years was strong enough for lawyers and judges to get a taste of what Turkey needs to turn back to. So those are my comments, overview from my perspective, and the work that I've done on this, and from my own experience as a human rights lawyer. And I would be really happy to have a discussion with any questions that might be on the table.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate it. It was very interesting to hear you speak. I have a couple of questions. You're very right about our history here in the United States, and we are still evolving on that issue ourselves. I have a question about, as you said, economic pressure and boycotts and potentially sanctions or something like that. You mentioned, Obama made Turkey a very prominent part of his administration, and then we got away from that with President Trump, and now we have President Biden. Do you think that President Biden's administration will have the wherewithal to do the boycotts and the sanctions, or does our NATO membership sort of prevent our being strong on those issues?
Well, that's a tough question. And of course, there are a lot of nuances to that here in the United States, right? So the approach of Biden and Obama was quite different for quite different reasons, right? Trump's approach generally, in my view, was tinged with a lot of economic self-interest. I think that we have got to, in the United States, organize to put pressure on the Biden administration. That has to happen. And I should have included that in the beginning too, and not just focus on Europe and Turkey. We have got to do that in the United States too. And the United States was a big part of that economic boycott of South Africa that went on. I mean, it was huge. And it took a long time. And you are right. I mean, we have in this country awful nativist thing going on. Even George Bush, our former president, said that we're off track on this. This nativism is crazy, and it's breaking up our democracy or our civil society. So I think that is going to be a problem, that we have to deal with across the board. But I think I'm glad. Thank you for the reminder too, to anybody from the United States, is that we have a lot to do here on the ground, getting this administration to be responsive to the plight of people in Turkey. That this is not just an economic issue. We may have to use economic means, but at the end of the day, it's human rights, and that is the only way that's going to change the judicial system. It's not going to change because of logic or and the beautiful documents, and we have many, many beautiful writings. It's just got to be hardcore organizing.
Okay, as an organizer and human rights attorney, we did have a question from one of our listeners. Is what would be the path if regime change happens, or as Dr. Dizzaz says, we go back to having a more independent, discretionary judiciary? What's the way forward for people who have actually suffered in Turkey? Those innocent people who, as Dr. says, there's a witch hunt against those people. Those people have actually been arrested, purged, tortured. What's the path for them to get back some of what they've lost? Is there a path for them once Turkey rights itself?
If Turkey rights itself, right? I'm pretty much of the opinion that won't happen until Erdogan's gone out of power. People rarely give up power voluntarily, right? Actually probably never give up power individually. So how to deal with the victims? I think that some of the, in terms of educating the American people about why we need to have sanctions or why we need to push economically, is to tell the stories of the individuals. I mean, to me, the ones that always resonate to me are putting pregnant women in jail. Mm-hmm. Those are absolutely awful. And I think Americans really understand how bad it is when you put a judge in jail for disagreeing, right? So I think those stories that show the misery and the suffering of people are helpful, right? So it's not just about principle, but what is the impact on the day-to-day lives of people that we can identify with? This might speak a bit to your nativism question too, right? We can identify with why are you putting a pregnant woman in jail simply because her husband left the country because he was being persecuted by the government? Why is she in jail? Why is she having her baby in jail? Why does she have to raise her kids in jail?
Or arresting people's parents.
Yeah, same thing. Same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
They're the parents.
Right, holding them hostage. Mm-hmm. But I think those are the stories that affect Americans, right? A lot of people's eyes gloss over when we start talking about principles. They are important. But our job, I think, as lawyers and judges is how do we translate these principles into people's everyday lives? And how do we do it in this context such that they motivate people to get involved, right? How do we do that? And it's a long process. None of this is easy.
None of this is easy. I totally agree with that. I do have one sort of personal question for you. Given what you talked about, traveling in Turkey, I also traveled in Turkey quite frequently and made many Turkish friends. And after the coup attempt, I have lost contact with a lot of those. These judges and all that you made friends with and your colleagues, are any of them able to be in contact with you, or are you a danger to them at this point?
I'm sure I have not tried to reach out to anybody because I figured if I did that just because of my background, that might be dangerous to them. I haven't heard from them either. So I'm unfortunately always assuming the worst because some of the judges I talked to were pretty strong, Yes. And I would imagine they've paid the price for it, but I feel bad because I really would like to know what's happening to them. We built up this friendship, but I don't dare try to contact them.
Yes, I agree. I thank you so much for your comments today. And I hope that we will, and of course, as an attorney, you started off with Marbury versus Madison, which is, the third day of law school. And so thank you for bringing in, the year of 1803. And I appreciate your comments. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It was a real honor. And thank you so much for all the kind words.
All right, everyone, we're going to move on. We're going to talk to Dr. Kemal Şahin. He is a former professor of law in the field of international human rights. He served as a national expert and consultant of the Council of Europe, and he, like Dr. Aydin, was purged from public service by Erdogan's state of emergency decree in 2016. As a victim of Erdogan's authoritarianism, his insight on today's topic is invaluable. Dr. Şahin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Wendy. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I'm going to bow out and let you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank especially Harvard University Law School, who organized and contributed to this conference. And thank you for inviting me to speak in this conference, providing me with an opportunity to be a voice for the victims of persecution committed by the Turkish government. Professor Dizzaz explained very well the reasons how and why the European states could remain silent towards the atrocities committed by the Turkish government. I like this calling human rights industry, and I'll not reconsider these issues in my presentation. Judge, I don't describe the negative developments and the reasons for the deterioration of judicial independence in Turkey. So I'm not going to repeat these points in my presentation as well. Professor Harrington emphasized that in the early beginning of this millennium, the Turkish judiciary saw itself not as a part of the other branches of the government, and the judges he met in Turkey were putting emphasis on their role in the protection of human rights, or being an arbiter between the government and the citizens. And he said also only the economic pressure to be imposed by international community may reverse this situation back in Turkey towards democratization, towards respect for human rights. Professor Skubic, on the other hand, said that the legitimacy of a government is based on the rule of law and on respect for universal human rights. Extrapolating from Turkish example, I would say that the theoretical framework of a legal system, although still important, it is important, cannot say if a government is legitimate or not. It is important to examine the practice of this framework to evaluate, to judge the legitimacy of a government. What is going on in Turkey now is not about the theoretical framework of legal system. Article 90 of the Turkish constitution is still enforced today, but no authority, including the judiciary, doesn't care about it. Article 90 briefly says, all the authorities, including the judiciary, should act and should be bound by the rules and principles of international human rights law.
Dr. Şahin.
Yes.
I am sorry to interrupt you. We could only see half of your face. Can you bring your camera down? And there we go.
Okay.
And speak up so that the technology can hear you correctly.
Okay, is that okay? Now you can hear me,
that's
right?
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna try to present you how the judiciary acts with regard especially to the cases of the government's opponents, dissidents. Before that, Wendy already presented me, and I served as a national expert and consultant within the framework of EU and Council of Europe projects in the field of human rights to ensure an awareness of human rights in Turkey. I'm one of those thousands who have fallen a victim to the cruel and relentless atrocities committed by Erdogan regime in Turkey, but mine, what I have gone through is a petty one compared to what the others, I did not commit the crime with which I was charged, and I know the reason why I have suffered, why I have been a target of the government. That is because I didn't allow anyone, including the government, to utilize me in their brazen acts, atrocities. I don't have any remorse and regret for what I have done. I believe I did the right thing when I taught and defended human rights. I taught and defended justice only. I've always been against any kind of interference by the military with the elected government. I've never supported any kind of violence in my life. I am the one who has been trying to be very careful not to commit petty traffic violations. But I was arrested, I was charged with, I was convicted of being a member of an armed terrorist organization, namely the so-called FETÖ. I spent more than a year in prison, and I was released pending trial. In the last 5 years, as a whole family, our life turned into a hell. If a person was accused of being a member of FETÖ, he or she would be treated as a heinous criminal, even more harshly than a serious killer or rapist in the country. This is not just a hypothetical assessment of the situation in the country, but a sheer fact. Okay, let me give you an example to show you. When my wife was waiting outside the prison complex to pay a regular visit to me, another visitor woman asked her for which crime I was detained. My wife said I was charged with being a FETÖ member. The woman cried out while thanking God for her husband wasn't one of them. My wife asked her about the crime for which her husband in prison. She said, while she seemed to be proud of that her husband murdered a man. That was the case. That is the case in Turkey now. What is going on in Turkey now? The term FETÖ is an acronym, a locution, which has not been chosen by the movement, by the community itself. The movement rather called itself hizmet in Turkish, in English, which means in English as service. The movement describes itself as a faith-inspired civil society movement that seeks to create a culture of coexistence within universal humanist values and is comprised of volunteers. And I find this approach very vital, very important, and I believe such an idea is a very valuable asset for us because it speaks directly from the heart of the Islamic belief. So what is FETÖ? Fethullah's terrorist organization. FETÖ is an expression that has been instrumentalized by Erdogan's ruling party and his government to summarily accuse the whole community of bearing a terrorist nature, a terrorist name, branding followers of this community as terrorists, and thus to subdue the institutions, including the judiciary and the public, under this ill-shaped description. Sorry. It serves to justify the total annihilation of the movement. The term is the main instrument of the Turkish government by which to declare no less than 1 million innocent people as terrorists. The topic I'll present here is about the deterioration of the rule of law in Turkey. So I put the title of my presentation as like the role of Turkey's judiciary in the commission of gross violations of human rights. The title seems to reflect exactly the opposite of the traditional role of the judiciary, not only in a full-fledged democracy, but also in every constitutional regime in which a minimum level of rule of law is respected or maintained. The traditional role of the judiciary in a democracy is to protect the rights and freedoms of people against the encroachment of the other branches of government, mainly of the executive. Therefore, the judiciary should be independent as far as possible from the other branches of government, mainly from the executive, to carry out its mandate accordingly. To emphasize the importance of this judicial independence for the protection of liberty against the arbitrary powers exercised by the other branches, Montesquieu, Baron de Montesquieu, in his renowned work, De l'Esprit de Loi, states, again, there is no liberty if the power to judge, judicial power, is not separated from legislative and executive. Now, I know how it might sound weird to some when I argue an authoritarian government like Turkey desperately needs the judiciary today to establish, to strengthen, and maintain its authoritarian regime. This wouldn't, however, be necessary in 1930s, but today it's necessary. So why would an authoritarian government need to have the judiciary to strengthen its authoritarian regime today? The answer is not indeed complicated. To answer this, I'll argue why Turkey, and you may count other countries of the same position, desperately needs judiciary to do so. Let me present some factual information about Turkey from which we can extrapolate, we can infer from the right grounds, we can infer reasons. Following the emergence of the notorious corruption cases of December 2013, in which some ministers of Erdogan and his own family members involved, Erdogan initiated a demonizing campaign against this community, this movement, Gülen movement, by blaming the community for setting up a parallel state and plotting a judicial coup to bring down his elected government. And these issues, I think, has been highlighted by the previous speaker, Judge Aydin, and I'll leave it here and I move on to some other points to use the time conveniently. Turkey had been a relatively constitutional parliamentary democracy based on rule of law and on the principle of respect for human rights until this notorious coup attempt of July 15, 2016. Then the regime started the transition to a Turkish type of presidential model of government. And this was achieved through a controversial referendum that was held under the oppressive measures taken on the pretext of fighting terrorism, a pretension which has been utilized to transform the country's regime to a sheer authoritarianism. Despite all the negative developments occurred after the botched coup, with regard to the rule of law and the protection of human rights, it's important to keep in mind that Turkey is a member of the United Nations and a party to nearly all the human rights treaties concluded under the United Nations. Turkey is also one of the founder states of the Council of Europe and remains a party to almost all the human rights treaties, most notably to the European Convention on Human Rights. It means that all these instruments place Turkey under an obligation to respect human rights within its jurisdiction, to make the government subject to the supervision by many international mechanisms with regard to the violations of human rights. Nevertheless, all the instruments, whether they are global or regional, require the applicants to exhaust the domestic remedies, internal remedies available under the legal systems of the state parties in question, before lodging their applications with the international bodies. To be more precise, if the Turkish government had not established, for instance, a state of emergency commission, a quasi-judicial body to deal with the applications to be brought by the victims of the state of emergency decrees, the victims would have been able to take their cases directly to the European Court of Human Rights or to the other international bodies established under the United Nations system. Indeed, the Commission rejected around 90% of the applications. But even this rate wasn't enough to render the remedy ineffective within the sense of Article, for instance, 35 of the European Convention, which provides for the admissibility criteria, including the exhaustion of domestic remedies. The Commission has delayed the review by the courts of the gross violations of human rights committed by the government for several years. Pushed it back. Given that the Commission's decisions are subject to the review by the administrative courts, the victims would have to wait for another several years to take their cases before the Constitutional Court, which would add another 2 years, at least 2 years, to bar the victim from bringing his or her case before the international bodies. Considering that the higher courts might quash the decisions of the lower courts, especially on some procedural grounds, this would earn the government a considerable extra time. In the end the government aimed to achieve would be reached. That is to say, the vicious cycle devised through the judiciary would delay the review process for about 10 more years, during which the victim would be condemned to a civil death, la mort civile. That is exactly what the government wants to achieve regarding Gulen community. Imagine that more than 200,000 of public employees were dismissed by decrees from the Le Service Public. Le Service Public is much a broader term, rather than its counterpart, civil servant, in English. So when they explained this point, and I'm not going to repeat this as well. Let's move on. With the exclusion of the Commission, the same process is true of the criminal cases, considering the very strict admissibility criteria and formalities imposed by or required by the European Convention on Human Rights. Very few percent of the cases would successfully be submitted to the European Court of Human Rights. Considering the ridiculous amounts of compensations offered by the European Court of Human Rights to the victims of the blatant, brazen violations of human rights committed by the Turkish government, you can guess how effective it might be, the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights might be. You may spend several years in prison without no legal ground, without showing no criminal activity against you, namely through a process that we should call a flagrant denial of justice. The European Court of Human Rights would offer you 10,000 euros for your loss as a non-pecuniary damage. Wow, a judge's monthly salary at the court exceeds 20,000 euros. Imagine the magnitude of what a Gulenist inmate has experienced in a prison, apart from the detention or imprisonment. I'm talking about physical conditions, but as well as non-physical, namely psychological conditions of being imprisoned on so-called fettered charge. Let me share here one of my own experience in the prison. I was sharing the prison cell with other 28 inmates. This number was higher in some other cells. By the way, the cell was originally constructed to serve for only 4 people. Imagine room is 40 square meter, nearly 400 square feet. And the number of dwellers is 29. There were only 8 double bunk beds made up of iron, so 16 people could use the beds. So there is no space for the other 13 people. What we were doing was that we were using the 2 single beds for 3 people. We had to use 1 toilet for these 29 people. We have to stay 24 hours in the room. We were not allowed to use any prison facilities, social interactions, courses provided by the prison administration. All kind of social activities were prohibited to us. Apart from that, I want to tell you about something else that is, I think, more striking because of the overcrowded prison population. Because of that reason, the sewage drain system was being clogged. And within 1 year of my imprisonment, I experienced this problem several times. Once after the evening wetting, our toilet drainage was completely clogged, and all the human waste, human disposals, were back up through the drain system. When we asked the guards to solve the problem, they just said they can do nothing at that moment, and we had to wait until the morning wetting has been completed. Then we asked them to take us to another toilet when we needed. They simply responded, "You can use the garbage bags for your toilet needs." It was very degrading, and I filed several petitions to the prison administration, to the Minister of Justice, and finally to the judges of the enforcement, judge of the enforcement. Out of them, only the judge answered and said, because of the current problem of overcrowded prisons, there was nothing to do about that. Now, imagine you spent several years like that. And after that, after 10 years or 15 years, the European Court of Human Rights would offer you 10,000 euros or something like that for a remedy, to remedy the violations of your rights and freedoms, your life, violations of your dignity, your humanity. By the way, after 3 months in pretrial detention, journalist and editor-in-chief of Cumhuriyet Daily, a famous journalist, now he's in exile in Germany, Can Dündar, was released in early 2016 on the order of Turkey's Constitutional Court. Remember that this release had happened before the botched coup attempt. Last December, the journalist was sentenced to 27 years of imprisonment on doing his job. Luckily, he was able to escape to Germany before the attempted coup. However, what I wanted to say is not the conviction of the journalist, but is that after the release of the journalist, President Erdogan got angry with the court's decision, and called on to the lower courts not to comply with either the decisions of the Constitutional Court or those of the European Court of Human Rights. And he added that, I'm quoting his words, "Why do you release this guy? You shouldn't have released him. Whatever the money that might be tailored for the European Court of Human Rights for the damages he would suffer, we will pay it. So don't release these people," he said. He asked the court. And now imagine the possible impact of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights in Turkey. I don't want to throw the baby with bathwater. I must say that the European Court of Human Rights and international community have a vital impact on Turkish government. In the absence of such international scrutiny, I would say the present government would already have established the gas chambers to terminate the thousands or maybe millions of lives. I see no light for justice in this long and ineffective judicial process for the victims of gross violations of human rights committed by the Turkish government.
Dr. Şahin,
Yes.
I don't want to take away from your academic contribution here today, but as Attorney Harrington was talking about the personal stories, I would like to ask you a few questions about your personal experience with this, because I knew that you had been purged, but I did not know that you had been imprisoned. So how long were you held?
I was detained 13 months, little more than a year.
And you were convicted of being
Yes, I was convicted of being a member of Gulen community.
Okay. And then what was your supposed sentence to be?
I was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months of imprisonment.
And then how were you able to achieve your release?
The procedure, requires the courts to release persons if they believed that the person would not abscond, would not flee from justice. Then if you were convicted of the crime, if the decision of the court was served, then you would be released after that. But of course, the trial is would be still pending.
Now, obviously, I don't want to ask you too many personal questions, but I'm assuming since you're with us here today that you have absconded from Turkey.
Yes.
And were your family able to get out with you as well?
Yeah. Yes. Before me, they left.
Okay.
In the United States now.
Okay, good. We're very glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I had understood, as you said, the prison cells were designed for very small amounts of people, just like we have prison cells here in the United States. They're not massive rooms. They're designed for just a handful of people, even as small as 2 people. But you were then placed with a lot of people in these cells. I had heard reports that Turkey was building extra prisons just for these enemies of the state. Is that still going on?
Yes. I heard that the government was now constructing 178 new prison complexes to put more thousands or hundreds of thousands of people into them. But if you allow me, I just, if I have the time, I just want to give you an analogy how the courts in Turkey, criminal courts, court of assize, acts or decides on what grounds they decide or what kind of evidence they submit against the defendants. So
yes,
I just want to, because I generally give this example to show to depict the picture.
Please, I have heard instances where it's as simple as having had a dollar bill.
Yeah, it's very simple. Yeah, you're right. But the UN Special Rapporteur following Purge reveals how the Turkish Judicial acts in certain cases. He said in his report, prosecutors regularly accuse individuals of unprovable and impossible to defend against allegations. So you cannot defend yourself against these allegations. When I was in prison, my roommates used to come to me for legal advice, to prepare their legal defenses against the criminal charges. When I looked at the content of the files, bill of indictments, I usually said these all are bullshits. I'm sorry, I cannot help you with preparing your defense. There is no need to respond to them. Later, I heard that they were offended by my apparent ignorance. They thought that I was totally indifferent to their cases, but it was not indeed true. I was, of course, caring about their cases, their grievance, about what they had gone through. However, the charges were so absurd, so preposterous to prepare a defense against. Imagine that the prosecutor charges you with the murder of thousands of people who died in the tsunami that happened in Indonesia. But you live in Chicago. The evidence that the prosecution brings against you is that you were swimming in your private pool, as is shown in the security cameras. So what? What is the relevance of this evidence, if it is evidence at all, to the crime with which you're charged? Prosecution answers your lawyer or you. Well, it's relevant because the security cameras proves that you created some waves while swimming. The tsunami is also a wave, however big it is, imagine that this argument is being accepted by the Turkish Judiciary, Turkish Judiciary from the bottom to the top. How can you prepare? How can you prepare a defense against such an argument, such a preposterous argument? Just think about that the intelligence service prepared a list of those who allegedly downloaded the Chat app. Chat app that all turned into a terrorist. So you cannot prepare your defense against such.
I think we go back to what Attorney Harrington said. Logic never carries the day. And these prosecutions clearly have no basis in logic in order, at least from any standpoint of what lawyers expect from evidence and the rule of law and not hearsay, and you can't defend the negative. And we learned that in law school. You know, the prosecution is supposed to prove their case, and you are supposed to put on your defense, but you can't prove that you didn't do something.
You cannot defend yourself against such preposterous, such absurd allegations. There is no evidence, presented by the prosecution. So
well, I am very, very sorry that you experienced that, and Dr. Aiden experienced such pain and separation from your family and being imprisoned. I can't even begin to understand what you experienced. And I thank you so much for not only your academic pursuit of this issue, but also your personal story, which I agree with Attorney Harrington is so important, that people be able to visualize what it was like to be in a cell with 28, 29 other people and having sewage coming up out of the toilet. I mean, and the various things that happened to you. So we're very blessed that you are now with us in the United States and your family. So alhamdulillah for that. We are very, very happy. I need to move on to the next speaker, but I thank you very much.
I thank you. It's my honor and pleasure being here with you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Is Attorney Anne Graham. She is a retired law professor and the founding director of the Business Law Institute at Hamline University School of Law. She was both regional counsel for the FDIC here in the United States and general counsel for the Texas Banking Department. She personally has traveled extensively in Turkey over the last 15 years. She did a very in-depth study of the banking system in Turkey for Texas Tech University School of Law. Like me, she cares very deeply for the future of Turkey and its people. And in her talk today, she's going to make a case that the rule of law and an independent judiciary is essential to be the foundation for any fair and economically prosperous Turkey that might evolve in the future. Attorney Graham, are you with us?
I am here. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm going to bow out and I thank you for your presentation. Please begin.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint, but I just want to say in beginning that this is a real honor for me to be able to take a closer look at the rule of law and how it's falling apart, unraveling in Turkey. And I think that will explain a lot of real world, real life, not theoretical things that have happened, not only to Dr. Sahin, but to hundreds and thousands of other academics, lawyers, judges, people involved in the media. I think this is something we all need to be concerned about. We live in a very connected world, and what impacts one country affects us all. So let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay, that wasn't it.
We can see it now.
Good. All right, here we are. Can you see that?
Yes,
Can you
ma'am.
see the slideshow? All right.
Yes.
So I've titled my talk, When the Rule of Law Breaks Down. And I think when we see how the law supports our entire society, we can see why an independent functioning judiciary is an important cornerstone of the rule of law. So just to recap, the rule of law has 4 universal principles. All persons, including the government, are accountable under the law. Some people call this the rule of law, not men. And it's also said no one is above the law. And so what is the law? Well, it has to be fair, publicized, and stable laws. It can't be something that we can't figure out or don't know about. Because if we have no notice of what the law is, if we can't understand it, we can't comply with it. And it doesn't provide stability for citizens, for businesses, for relationships across the globe. There also has to be access to fair legal process. And Dr. Sahin alluded to that when he talked about the fact that once the states of emergency began to be declared, there was a suspension of access to legal process, that the normal ways of appeal were changed, and then people could not go directly to the European Court of Human Rights, but they had no effective domestic remedy either. So they really were lacking in this access to fair legal process. And again, these legal rights and responsibilities should be enforced equally for everyone. This fair legal process should protect property rights and human rights. And I have always been very cognizant of my responsibility as a lawyer. The whole of the rule of law depends on independent and ethical lawyers and judges. Without these instruments, agents of the law, we really cannot have a rule of law. Okay, so what is the impact of the rule of law? Why do we care about it? Well, this is what protects our human rights. It keeps us from being thrown into prison on frivolous charges that can't be supported. It protects our property rights so that the government can't just come and take our property. It allows us to live in a safe and ordered society. And of course, if you want to look at this from the bottom line, like a lot of people in the US do, economic development depends on a stable rule of law within the country, as does global trade. If there's no confidence on the part of business that they understand the laws and that the laws will be implemented and enforced just as they read, then it's almost impossible to do business under those circumstances. Well, where does Turkey stand with the rule of law? The World Justice Project has a rule of law ranking for 2020, and unfortunately, it's not good news. In 2020, Turkey ranked very close to the bottom globally in terms of countries that do not have an effective rule of law. Turkey was 107 out of 128. That is to say, of 128 countries, Turkey ranked 107. But it gets worse. Turkey's included regionally in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And Turkey ranked dead last, 14 of 14, in terms of the rule of law within its own region. Turkey's considered an upper middle income country, and it ranked 40 of 42 upper middle income countries. I'm going to refer later to some other objective reviews of the rule of law in Turkey. So don't take my word for it. These outside sources find the same thing. The rule of law is under strong threat in Turkey, and we all need to be concerned about that. Maybe as a person who's traveled in Turkey, who has Turkish friends, who has heard people like Dr. Sahin speak, the human rights aspect of a weak rule of law is what really breaks my heart. When we think of our freedoms, we think of freedom of speech, freedom to say our opinions, not to incite riots, not to call for insurrection, not to engage in hate speech, but we're entitled to express our opinion on current events. We're entitled to speak about things that involve the government, whether we disagree or whether we agree. And freedom of the press. Without a free press, the people cannot know what is going on. They can't have an objective source of information on which they can base their votes. So without freedom of the press, their human rights are being infringed on. And when people are imprisoned unjustly and there's no report of it, the global community can't act on it either. One of the first manifestations that Turkey was going down the wrong road was infringement of this right to assemble and right to engage in peaceful protest. I'll do a little bit of timeline in a minute, but this is a basic right of citizens. Freedom to work. We're going to talk about academics, judges, teachers, just regular people who were fired from their jobs on very flimsy grounds. As we were talking about a moment ago, on grounds that amounted to unsustainable allegations that couldn't be proved or disproved. And they were enough to get you fired. They might even be enough to get you thrown in prison. And in many instances, the promise was made, you will never work in academia again. You will never hold a judgeship again. So what you had worked your whole life for was eroded in one fell swoop. And of course, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment and torture. And I think there hasn't been enough global outcry about this. I'm like Jim Harrington, afraid to contact my friends in Turkey. I'm not sure what is going on. I was able to go back to Turkey in January of 2019 at a time when Jim Harrington and some other of my friends cautioned me about going back, but I went as part of my seminary class studying a religious topic, and so I was able to fly under the radar, but I would not risk it again. I like my life in the US, and I don't want to have my passport seized or something like that. And freedom from government seizure of property. When I first started going to Turkey in 2006, I toured schools, universities, hospitals, and media outlets, television, newspaper. These were remarkable, especially the education facilities in poorer regions of Turkey, where the idea was if these people in poverty-stricken rural areas only had access to education, they could improve their lot. Turkey would be a better country. Turkey would have more productive citizens. And again, through government seizure of media outlets, universities, and businesses, the wealth that individuals had built up, and by wealth, I don't mean necessarily wealthy, I just mean the money that people had earned and saved and invested in property was taken away in a moment, destroyed. And freedom in education, again, if you don't have a well-educated population, you simply can't advance in this globally connected digital world. Your citizens must be educated, informed, and trained for today's work requirements. And independent and impartial judges are part of the cornerstone. And those are two different things. Independent means they're not subject to influence, and impartial means that they don't have a predetermined idea about who should win and who should lose, regardless of the facts of the case. The independence of the judiciary must be guaranteed in law to be a good part of the rule of law. The judgments have to be based on facts and law, and the facts have to be relevant, as we were just discussing, to the law that's being applied. There can't be any improper influence, threats, or interference, and that includes things we've already talked about too, like letting a judge know that if they rule a certain way, it won't be enforced. Threatening to reassign a judge or firing someone, and then that threat stands for everybody in that same position. Or interference, actually trying to affect the judgment before or while a trial is in process. In order to be independent, judges have to have security during the term of their office. And you can see why. They can't be worried about whether they're going to be fired or whether they're going to be reassigned to the hinterlands or a lower court. Under the rule of law, they can be removed only for incapacity. Let's say a judge had a heart attack or a stroke and could not work. That would be grounds for removal. Or behavior that makes the judge unfit for duties. And that would be something like frequently appearing drunk on the bench or something like that. But in the US, even many minor crimes are not enough to substantiate removal from office. And to be independent, the judicial process must occur in open court. It can't be a secret star chamber that no one is allowed into, no one can look over or review. It has to be open to the public. And judges have to not only be independent, but they have to be perceived as independent. People have to have trust in their judges. So even just the appearance of being subject to influence is enough to destroy this requirement that we have independent and impartial judges. Okay, again, we've talked about the separation of powers, and we're going to talk more about how that's definitely been usurped in Turkey. Everybody knows there are three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. In Turkey, the executive branch used to be headed by the prime minister, and then the law was changed. Now the head of government is the president. And the legislative system was parliamentary. But a lot of their power has been eroded also. That's a topic for another day. In terms of the judiciary, it's supposed to have equal weight with the other two branches. In fact, each of these legs of the government must be able to stand up to the others. No one is paramount to the others. Although the judicial branch has review of both, but only under the law. And infringement of the executive on the other two branches is what pushes a country toward dictatorship. Okay, so how did we get to where we are now in Turkey? What was the path to authoritarianism? And I take this back to the Gezi Park demonstrations in 2013, because I think this is where Erdogan learned some of his tactics, and they worked. So whatever works, you try again. There was a plan to cut down some trees in this public park in Istanbul and build a shopping mall. There were demonstrations. They were peaceable, at least at first, until the police stepped in and just violently crushed the demonstrations. And for several days, they rounded up people. There was a media blackout. Again, if people don't get unbiased news about what's happening when it's happening, you can't have a fair society. And then another step, another piece of the picture as we go down the slippery slope here occurred in December 2013, the corruption scandal. And I won't go into that, but it touched the very, very highest levels of government. And of course, everybody was horrified by the idea of millions of dollars in shoeboxes that probably went to launder money and represented payments to top people in the government. But the court system decided not to pursue these cases. So do you think they were independent? Do you think they were free from influence? I don't think so. Here again, one of the first steps toward eroding the rule of law. And one of the external reviews of human rights is conducted by the European Court of Human Rights. This looks at the situation in Turkey through the cases that come before it. And in January 2014, they began to see erosion of the rule of law. In January 2014, a publishing company was closed, and that case went before the European Court of Human Rights, which found violations of the freedom of expression. Same year, conviction of a law professor for criticizing judges in an academic article. This conviction violated the right of free expression and academic freedom. Continuing on in 2014, conviction of journalists and closing a newspaper violates the right to a fair trial and freedom of expression. Turkey's constitutional court, its highest court, did function in a manner of speaking until there were judicial purges, which we're going to talk about. Even the constitutional court at this time in 2014 was still finding in favor of some of the people who claimed that their human rights had been violated. But if you can't prevail under the rule of law, change the rules. Every kid knows this. In October 2014, the government really began to use a heavy hand in interfering with the judiciary. The government endorsed candidates, and those candidates, those government endorsed candidates, won a majority of seats on an oversight body of the entire judiciary. This body is the one that appoints judges, removes judges, reassigns judges. And the people who were campaigning were promised salary increases and pardons if they would vote for government endorsed candidates for the oversight body. Okay, that is beyond the pale, as everyone can see. That's a breach of judicial independence and separation of powers. And then new criminal judgeships for peace were created, and that changed the standard appeals procedure. It could be used as a government weapon. The judicial purges, the firing, reassigning, imprisonment of judges had a chilling effect, not only on the people who were personally impacted, but on their colleagues. If you saw someone on your court, another judge, imprisoned, fired, reassigned, wouldn't you be a little leery of stepping out boldly in a way that wasn't congruent with what the government wanted? I would be. And thank goodness there were judges who were willing to take that risk, who were still true to their ethics, to their responsibility as judges, to be fair, to be independent, to be impartial. Continuing on to the last constitutional referendum, the country went from parliamentary to a presidential system. And this had the impact of consolidating more power in the hands of the president and eroding many powers of the legislative body. This also gave Erdogan a way to extend his head of governmentship. He was able to move from being the prime minister to being president, to being a very powerful president. And the state of emergencies just seemed to go on and on. This was after the supposed coup in 2016, but there were actually 7 extensions of the state of emergency. And by being in a state of emergency, even the European Court of Human Rights recognizes that some legal safeguards may be suspended, may be temporarily not enforced. But when you just keep on extending the state of emergency, you never get to the point where people whose rights are infringed have a real remedy, have an alternative, have a way to contest what's being done to them. And you can see how intertwined all these rights and freedoms are when we talk about the rule of law. If we shut down the free press and social media, the people have no way to know what's going on. They can't be informed about their votes. They can't protest. This undercuts the entire stable fabric of a country. So here are some examples. Twitter was blocked before the 2014 elections. YouTube was banned. The European court held that unconstitutional. Wikipedia has been permanently blocked. And the repression only increased after the coup attempt, if it was that, on July 15th, 2016. Again, all these infringements on our basic rights are linked. Each one is another way of chipping away at the rule of law. Jailing journalists. Turkey's jailed more journalists than any other country in the world. Confiscating media outlets. Around 200 were initially suspended and 175 remain closed. Think about that. In a country the size of Turkey, 175 news outlets have been closed. Newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, all closed. That leaves the news in the hands of the government. So the only information that people have has been skewed and twisted and made to benefit the government. Firing university professors. Well, I was one, and I'll tell you that just like lawyers, university professors believe that they have a responsibility to educate the next generation and to do research that gives more information to the population of a country. Not only were university professors fired, whole universities were closed. And the reassigning, firing, and jailing of judges we've talked about. In terms of academics, one of the landmarks on our timeline is January 2016. This became just a list of people that the government could target. And again, we talked about outside observers like the European Court of Human Rights, the Venice Commission, and the European Court of Human Rights. All of these outside observers have called the direction Turkey is headed a dangerous step backwards. I love this. In fact, I may just close on this. A German journalist was doing an interview with Erdogan, and he said to Erdogan, "Are you asking me why the German public sees you as a dictator?" Well, the answer is because in no other country in the world are there as many journalists behind bars as there are in Turkey. Because German journalists are in prison and nobody knows why. Because tens of thousands of people lost their jobs simply because they're suspected of having participated or being connected to someone who participated in the attempted coup. And the journalist concluded, those are a few of the reasons why you enjoy such a reputation. Just a few. I want to say that in terms of economic impact, we are to this day seeing the influence of the erosion of the rule of law. In March of this year, Turkey's lira plunged 15%. And that goes on today. I looked up yesterday's news. It's still dropping. The lira has lost half its value since 2018. As I said in the beginning, if businesses can't count on stable law, even the economic development of a country is placed at risk. So I want to say thank you very much. And I really appreciated hearing everybody else's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Attorney Graham. We appreciate your thoughts. I did let you go over just a little bit because I thought it was very, very important that you were able to get in that timeline, because it was something sort of almost out of a dictator's playbook. That whole thing of you stop the ability to assemble and the rights to peaceful protest. You stop the access to information by cutting off the free press. Then you stop the right of free speech, being able to say things online, you know, Twitter and various things like that. Blocking of information, people unable to find out for themselves what the truth is. And so I think it was very, very important for us to get this on the record today. Just that slippery slope, as you called it, all the way from 2013 to today. And I really appreciate you being able to get that in. I will ask you one question, if you don't mind. Attorney Harrington was talking about the economic pressure on Turkey. And since you've ended with the economic impact and the value of the lira plunging so much, it is important that the economic trade, global trade, there has to be stability in order to attract investments in the country. So Attorney Harrington was suggesting that we needed to have boycotts and sanctions and that sort of thing. I had asked him if he thought that having the new administration of President Biden here in the US if he might have the ability to put those boycotts and sanctions on the administration in Turkey. What are your thoughts on that potential way forward, absent regime change, whether economic pressure could possibly turn things around?
Well, I have mixed feelings about global sanctions. And the reason for that is that it hurts the people in the sanctioned country so much. They will go hungry. They will go without needed commodities. And I'm not entirely favorable about sanctions from that respect. But I would expect this administration, for one thing, I don't think we'll see Biden with his arm around Erdogan being buddy-buddy with him. I think he'll at least be talking about how critical it is that there be some kind of change in the path that Turkey is on. And I think private businesses definitely have the power to choose not to do business with a regime like this. And that, I think, I would rely, I'm not necessarily a free market person totally, but I do believe that businesses have the ability to change the direction of a country just because they need legal stability.
Okay, I agree with you. I thank you for those comments. I think we're going to move on to Mr. Young, if you don't mind. I appreciate. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Young. Last but certainly not least, thank you so much for hanging in with us today. To be the last speaker. Mr. Young is a former police officer. He is a former member and chief government whip of the Alberta legislature in Canada. Currently, he is a consultant, project manager, strategic advisor, and executive coach to businesses and individuals facing economic, market, and life changes. But today specifically, he's going to be using his prior experience as a police officer and in government in Canada to discuss police independence and how a separation from political interference in policing is vital in a just society. Mr. Young, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you very much. Please begin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, I feel quite honored with the lineup presenters thus far, and certainly their credentials and experience. And I'm quite humbled by their experience in Turkey, especially those who have suffered as a result of what has been happening in Turkey. So I have a bit of let me just expand on my experience. I was a policeman for 20 years. Worked all the way from being a beat cop all the way up to ended up as a staff sergeant, and did lots of presentations around North America. I actually did a presentation that somebody else presented in Turkey back in the day, but on police structure and principles and roles. And then I decided to get out of that dangerous business and go into a more dangerous business, which is politics. And I ended up getting elected in Alberta at our provincial level as a member of the Legislative Assembly. And our party formed government. So I was in government and serving as the chief government whip. So I want to explore with through my presentation today the distinction between your roles and responsibilities as a police officer on the street, how that connects with the larger judicial system in terms of the courts, the judges, corrections, and then in my putting on a different hat, and it is a very different hat. It is as a politician, is part of the legislative process where bills are drafted. Regulations are changed, government direction goes, and then also the distinction between that legislative branch and then the government. So we have had ministers who are running different ministries like justice and education. And so what we're seeing that has happened in Turkey is have seen the erosion of each of those institutions. They haven't got rid of them, but the erosion of the principles. Yes, we still have courts. We listen to lawyers making arguments, and we listened about policemen arresting people and putting in. So the jails are there, the police are there, judges are all there, but what has been eroded is the complete legitimacy of it. And it's not something like, I'm not going to pat ourselves on the back here in North America and Canada or the US. I mean, I could point a lot of fingers at the threats of the rule of law, convicting people in the media, the ongoing protests, violent protests, not peaceful protests, and those influences on the rule of law. So it's a constant effort that countries at the state, provincial, all these levels that need to honor that rule of law and those principles around there, because even well-intended groups will claim, and this is the biggest threat to I think our society these days. And I just taught a class early this morning, and we were talking about ethics, and it's that the righteous cause. And so I'm the good guy, so it's okay to undermine the rule of law or skip over processes, or because I don't agree with them. And so this is where the discipline happens, is required. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a bit of a presentation that it's just something to walk through for the most part with everyone here. And so my topic is police independence and separation from political interference in a just society. And so there's some nuances, and I'll try and explain the differences between US and Canada. My experience in Turkey is got lots of Turkish friends. I'm involved in the community here. I had the honor of going to Turkey and meeting many people from the movement back in 2017. It was actually just after Gezi Park and all those kind of things. So didn't see anything that, but I certainly came to understand about it. So we'll just go through some of the things here. Let's see if it's not working. Okay. Okay, so as it was explained by the previous presenter, there's three branches of government, right? This is this is political science 101, right? Where the legislative branch makes the laws, the judiciary that are that have those role of making decisions around that, and the executive branch in terms of administering government. Okay, and the reason we have these distinct branches because each branch has a responsibility for their job. No one has too much power. Okay, these separations, whether it's separation from church and state or separation of branches of governments, are used to define and distinguish between roles. And often it's because it's a measure to around conflict and overpower and preserve rights. So it creates that framework for that. So the legislative branch makes laws. Okay, no surprise there. We've heard lots about that, and sets apart funds for government. So the court system, this is where we hear cases and arguments are made. Okay, and the executive branch. Okay, and we have, and in the United States, have different levels of government. We have federal, provincial or state, municipal at the city level, and then we have this unique element called First Nations or tribal that are sort of an entity unto themselves. And then within each of those levels of government, there's different departments. Now, we have health, education, police, roads, and those are different depending on where you go. It'll be different who's responsible for what in each country. Of course, very different if you're in the United Kingdom and the Westminster parliamentary system of government, or if you're in the United States or in Canada. But these are kind of things. We're just going to focus on the police. And in Canada, police is by our constitution, policing is a provincial responsibility. Now you think, oh, what about the RCMP? That's a federal police agency, but they are operating at the behest of the provincial authorities, provincial governments in terms of they're contracted for, but they do provide a national police service. I did a lot of research and stuff and presentations on the distinction for community policing, getting involved with problems that are facing communities and crime and disorder, and found an interesting fact on how they're organizing. So in where I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, we have a police service, the Edmonton Police Service. And if you were in Washington, D.C., and I had a presentation there, you wouldn't believe how many different police agencies they have in Washington, D.C. I think the number I heard was like 47 different police agencies in Washington, D.C. itself. They have Washington Metro. Then they got the FBI, the DEA. The one I like is the FBI police. So they have a separate police service for FBI buildings. So they're just organized differently. And they've separated that in a certain way, but they each have their own accountabilities. So regardless of how they're organized, they have the checks and balances in place. And I should say, it hasn't always been that way. And we're trying to separate this political interference with the police. You can imagine. And so as a Canadian, I find it odd that sheriffs of small towns get elected. Like, that's a political thing. And so to me, there's a bit of a conflict, but at the same time, there's an accountability, because if they're not delivering on what the community needs, then they don't get elected. That we don't have that here. People get hired through a police commission. And at some levels in the US, judges get elected as well. So very different. So the police, I want to talk about, I love the statute, and I always put it up when I'm talking about with my students, when I teach law as it relates to policing, and I talk, what is law? And I usually go to my definition, which is a number of elements. Law is a set of rules or guidelines. Do this, don't do that, okay? And they apply to a certain group of people. a country, a province, a municipality. Okay. And there's always also the third of four elements is there's consequences if you don't follow the rules, right? And whether it's in statute or it's in case law, there's consequences for breaching these laws, as is determined through a justice system. Now, the last part of the definition of law is this little thing here, which is she's holding in her left hand, and that's I call it, what are you going to do about it if I do break a law? And that's the enforcement. And there needs to be, that's the police service. Unfortunately, in lots of our history, police forces have been used in, well, breaking up race riots in the 60s, in the 50s in Canada, they were used to break up union measures and all those kind of stuff. And unfortunately, there's a plethora of old movies where police are used as tools of political tools to enact change. We've evolved, and those things have been the checks and balances, usually we've made all the mistakes, so we sort of put in those things because we've learned from them. So the foundations that we need to uphold are, of course, the rule of law. Police are there to uphold the rule of law. Okay, and we've had a really good definition from the previous presenter. There needs to be a level of transparency. Okay, and that's part of the whole judicial system. You do not get, if you get arrested, you need to have reasonable probable grounds, or what they call it, just cause or whatever in the States, but you need to have reasons to arrest somebody, and you need to have access to a lawyer. And there's this concept called habeas corpus, which is Latin from bring the body forward. So somebody gets to have a hearing right away. So you're not arrested and locked away. Those are the principles of our system. Now, we've heard lots of stories here about how people would get arrested, don't get a trial, get locked away for a period of time. And, Turkey is not the only place. Right now that's happening it happens in China all the time. It happens in other kind of these dictator places that don't honor the rule of law and human rights. Just free from political interference. So how do we do that? We need to have, and I'm not speaking out of an expert, but at some point, there was this investigation into the corruption in 2013. And then at some point, the people who they found had grounds based on that did not get arrested. But the politicians decided to fire the judges and the police and all those kind of people. So something failed there. There was a breakdown at that level. When I was a policeman, we never had any political interference. We knew who the municipal councilors were and people were, but they had no role and in terms of trying to influence us. Our oversight body in Canada is generally called a commission. They have this, it's a committee that oversees police departments. They're like a board of directors on a company, and their role is that oversight, budget submissions, and to hire a police chief who runs the department. So that's the accountability, not politicians. And of course, we uphold rights. Somebody, also one of the previous speakers mentioned in Turkey, they moved from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential one. And I actually asked this question today. It says, in Canada, we don't have a parliamentary democracy. We have a constitutional democracy. And since 1981, when we brought in our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, every law needs to align with that Constitution. And so, of course, they're interpreted by the courts through case law. And they're pretty principled. The Charter says things like everyone has the right to be free from arbitrary search and seizure. Okay, sounds very reasonable. Now, of course, the courts since then and case law and have defined what is reasonable. Okay, and so now we have that's the structure, but we operate on a constitutional democracy, and Parliament cannot make any law they want. They have to make laws that are consistent and uphold those constitutional rights. And as I mentioned, whatever police service there is, there needs to be that accountability and oversight, because policemen and departments are going to make mistakes. There's going to have some problems. There needs to be somebody who is going to manage that or deal with that and take the proper action, whether it's review officers or review departments or make those kind of decisions and be accountable to the public. So where do our a little bit of back in history, there's three foundations. There's laws, which of course the police uphold. There's professional standards and ethics, and we all have our individual ethics and standards. But the professional standards, where do those come from? And this is one of the big sources, and this is basically the modernization of police came in 1829 by a politician named Sir Robert Peel, and he said the police are the public and the public are the police. There's no difference. It's not this sort of top-down thing. We are the same thing. We're just, police are paid full-time to uphold the safety of the public. And there's a couple of those principles that are still ring very true today. One is demonstrate absolute and partial service to law in complete independence of policy and without regard to the justice or injustice of the substance of the individual laws. So basically that's impartial service. Maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic traditions that the police are the public and the public are the police, and that the public are the police, and the police, being only members of the public, were paid to give full-time attention to the duties are incumbent on every citizen of the interests of community welfare and existence. So that idea that the police are an enforcement arm of the politicians is wrong, and it is, going back to 1829, that was the foundation of these principles that have basically created modern policing from Peel's principles. Another one here is demonstrate absolute impartial service of law to complete independence of all areas. That was just strict adherence to police executive functions and refrain from seeming to usurp powers of the judiciary, of avenging individuals of the state, or the authority of judging guilt and innocent and punishing the guilty. So this is the idea that the police are impartial, do not act as, they're part of the judicial process in terms of arresting, but they don't decide. So what happened in Turkey, 2013? Just the corruption. What happened? When that happened, there should have been people in jail, but something broke down there. 2,000 police officers fired and jailed. Interesting, when I was a politician, I was at an event and we had the Turkish ambassador at the event. And I had been to Turkey by that time, and but he didn't know what I know. Not a lot, unfortunately, not enough people know about the whole dynamic in Turkey and the distinction between the people who support the movement and the principles of that, and the ones who turned a blind eye and sort of in Turkey. And so he came and talked to me about this corruption that was going on there. And he says, well, if you were doing an investigation, wouldn't you need approval to investigate somebody? And I go, well, who's giving me the approval? The person who's the corrupt one? That's the argument that he's making. He was making this administrative argument to say that not whether the crime was corrupt or if the investigation was bad, but you didn't have approval and didn't have the independence to investigate crime. And so I kind of played dumb with him because I was at a political event, but I was quite shocked that this is the story that he was trying to sell me. Like any policeman, like, can you imagine? This is unbelievable. This is a police vehicle dragging somebody through the streets. That isn't policing. That's it. You're enabling a terrorist organization when you're doing that. You've completely abandoned everything. And then, of course, this guy here who assassinated the Russian ambassador, and he was basically. So this is another important part of policing: is in order to maintain the integrity, you need to have very robust recruiting, because you need to bring in people of ethical standards who come through, not referrals, which is what this guy went through the police and became endorsed by Erdogan. You know what a politician's endorsement for a recruit coming into a police service is here? It's no different than anyone else's. None, no special, nothing special. So that's what, but this was, he was able to go through and basically be enacted this terrorist act on behalf of. So I just going to stop sharing my screen. And so whatever, just want to finish off, and I'm certainly welcome to take any questions, but the distinction between the police as a who are the public and are there to enforce judicially or reasonably enforce under the rule of law fairly the laws, and then connect with the rest of the judicial system. And there's accountability and oversight, but something broke down in Turkey where that oversight, and they turned the police into, well, they're not even police. It's they're like I said, and we see this in other history. We can look back in history. We had the brown shirts in Germany who were political operatives, and then the Gestapo. We see this in other places where they were acting, had a facade of police, but they're really enforcing a political regime. So if you, so it's and this is all before. I know we had lots of lawyers and attorneys and judges here, but this is on the street before it even happens, before they even get into jail. This is the front end of where the rule of law needs to occur.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I appreciate it. I wanted to go back to one thing that you did say. When you were talking to the ambassador from Turkey, and he was suggesting that criminal cases, investigations, were sort of from the top down, sort of approved. So there was an approved investigation. I'm an attorney now, but my first career was in law enforcement. So I have the background that you, not nearly as long. Oh my goodness. No, I didn't put in 20 years, but I had that background. And so I understand that, you know, the one thing that police officers do is they go out, they meet with the victims of the crime, and then they investigate the crime. They bring forth what they suspect are the charges, and then someone within the court system then takes on that, the prosecutor, etc., takes on that and prosecutes those charges against the person and is responsible for obtaining a conviction. So how would the process, how in the world would a process work for a police department if you went out and met with the victim and you had to get the investigation approved?
Well, and that's exactly it. If you're holding the keys, even if you have a whole organization that is a righteous and well honorable police service, if you're holding the keys, say, and not investigating, that's corruption. If you're aware of crime and not investigating, or investigating, being selective, not based on the needs of the community or priority of things, and then that's corruption. And it's a little different in Canada here than the US. I mean, when I was a policeman, I charged people and they'd have first appearance, and then if they pled guilty or not guilty, and then the prosecutors would get, okay, here's the game. So it's a little different, but the same principle applies. But nobody is filtering our if we had a politician in Canada, and if I as an officer, I would investigate that. I would need approval. You know, it would probably work through my ranks in terms of they would prioritize it. But imagine if they were able to dismiss that And, that is, and we're not talking parking tickets here. We're talking, like you said, boxes of cash and money.
Boxes of cash,
And of
yes.
course, and that was just the beginning, right? So when somebody can be censured, when good people can be censured in fulfilling their duty as police officers or prosecutors or judges, then that is the problem. So where did that chain break? So they investigated, they found the boxes of money, the corruption and all that kind of stuff. And then it got handed to the prosecution and the judge. Where did it stop? Because somebody should have been to jail. So that, and I don't know enough to say that, but there's a chain, a logical chain that happens. And there was some corruption happened to break that chain of the judicial system in Turkey.
Well, and I think just having the power as an executive to fire the police and the judges completely ruins the system.
So the only way to fire, the only people who can fire a police chief in Canada would be their police commission.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the only way, and there's a clear process even to deal with officers who've made some problems that need to be addressed, censured, or fired, and that's all very well established. But to sort of summarily, from a political agenda, which I don't think that was even hidden, a political agenda, you're fired. You're judge, you're fired. Like, that's unbelievable. There's the checks and balances have been eroded. So
yes, it wasn't even. I think even a conspiracy theory. Everyone has their conspiracy theories about what goes on in government, but it wasn't even a conspiracy theory. It wasn't even hidden. He just did it.
Exactly. It's not. There's. You're right. Politics is a messy game since Machiavellian wrote his book about a prince. But it's been. Politics is politics. But you need to separate that and the legitimacy of the judicial system needs to be the cornerstone, free from political interference. And they didn't even hide it. But I don't understand how it was able to do it. You're fired. Yeah, you don't have standing. You can't do that. But somebody honored that direction. So that's, and I'll tell you, like, when I was an MLA, I went to Turkey when I was a politician, and I will say that people have too high of a respect for politicians in Turkey. And I say this to my friend all the time. Oh, you're a politician, No. So what? I'm nobody. I'm nobody special. I'm just a person, just like a police or the public are the police, and the police are the public. Politicians are people, and they're not special, and so having this sort of exaggerated respect or thing, like king-like respect. No, we don't have that here in North America. I don't think. We're like, we'll criticize them, and they should be if they're public officials, and they should be criticized. And just because I say it doesn't mean it's so. And there needs to be legal standing. You need to have authority, and in often cases, you need to have honored the process to make that decision through your legislative or Congress or state legislature, or those kind of things, to legitimately do it. And there'll be lawyers all along the way to make sure you're aligning with that process. But to summarily dismiss judges and police officers, there was either the governance wasn't set up or somebody ignored it.
Well, and maybe history will look back on this and we will eventually find out that it had a lot to do with shoeboxes of cash.
Right. But yeah, and I'm sure, like, payoffs unfortunately happen everywhere. But even with payoffs, there's checks and balances in place that no one person can summarily do that. Right? Yes. So, the idea of a jury, right? If you can get 12 people to agree, but I don't, unless they paid off everyone, maybe.
And that's, theoretically would be impossible, but it seems to have been what happened, because everyone sort of fell in line all at the same time. So I certainly would love to continue the conversation of how that eroded. But we are going to close out for today. Thank you so much for waiting until the end and being our last speaker. The last speaker, it's always rough, so I appreciate it very much. And I thank you for participating today.
My pleasure.
Obviously, I want to thank all of our speakers for participating today, and especially we want to thank Howard University School of Law for sponsoring this virtual conference. There's ways for you to get more information about the current situation in Turkey. There are a couple of websites that you can visit, turkeytribunal.com, nordicmonitor.com, silenceturkey.org, or turkeypurge.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you can see both prior conferences that have happened and future conferences that we might have on the decline of freedoms in Turkey. What can you do? Well, first, you can help us get the word out about the abuses of power in Turkey by sharing what you learn with your networks of friends on social media, by sharing this YouTube channel, by sharing this conference, by sharing the websites that you visit and the information that you receive. Think about what was told earlier today about going to the UN's complaint page and making complaints, writing your political leaders. Don't rely just on the people who have been exiled from Turkey to fight this battle. Please leave feedback and comments on this YouTube page as well, so that others will know what you're thinking. And I really appreciate each of you for watching throughout the globe. And thank you again for participating in our conference. Have a good evening.